Will you stop with the manners? Nick, the praised girl in the short golden dress, reached out to her brother. Have you had a lot to drink already? Nick leaned back in his chair and spread his arms. His jacket was gray, and his shirt the color of a dusty rose. The fingers of his right hand carelessly held a glass of undiluted whiskey, and he shook it slightly, making the dark amber liquid glow inside. Why? Rejoice. Why have enough? My lifestyle is freedom without boundaries. I have money. I can drink if I want, buy girls like you if I want. Rainsma silently swallowed her resentment. She was used to his harsh language, his wealth and his temper. Besides, he was quite good at providing her with expensive gifts. A man like Nick Swan never gave much thought to how other people felt. His nature demanded an easy life, attention to himself. Nevertheless, people were drawn to him, attracted by his thirst for life, charm, ease. In addition, an important factor was the fact that sometimes Nick literally threw money. He could break off in the middle of the night and buy tickets for some excursion to Africa, and then wake up calls to his friends and call them with him, putting before the fact. He indiscriminately gave branded items to random girls. No, this young man in his 30s was not running any serious business, investing or working anywhere at all. Heir to his father, who died in a car accident 7 years ago, he successfully and happily spent the rest of the family fortune. No, Nick was undoubtedly thinking about the future, but he saw it as quite secure and, again, effortless. Nick's grandfather, the founder of the largest chain of organic grocery stores, owned major assets, an impressive fortune, and a huge 3-story mansion. And it was up to him, the only grandson, to pass it all on. How are you doing? Nick's friend Matthew approached the couple with a smile. In his hand was an open bottle of champagne. We're great. Nick replied with a laugh and took a swig of his whiskey. A good deal, Matthew chuckled. Never mind that. Are you as far away from business as I am from opera and ballet? Nick nodded. No argument there. Feeling a sudden vibration in the area around his chest, he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. With the noise of the club music, the ringing couldn't be heard anyway, so he picked the call. Hello, Nick shouted into the receiver, but he couldn't make out the answer. He made a sign, and Matthew stepped outside, automatically continuing to hold the glass of whiskey in his hand. Despite the noise of passing cars, it was comfortably quiet here compared to the nightclub. The dusky breeze of early spring was refreshing and invigorating. Go ahead, Swan said. Mr. Nick Swan, the voice said politely. My name is Andrew. Vincent, I'm your grandfather Swan Sam's notary. Please accept my condolences, and I apologize for the late call. Nick took a quick swig of whiskey and suddenly choked. He coughed. I don't get it. What condolences? The voice on the other end seemed to betray his confusion. Weren't you informed? Your grandfather passed away this morning after a long illness? Nick was silent for a few seconds. A muffled, unpleasant ache appeared in his head. He didn't know if he should believe this news. Who is this unknown notary? How can I be sure of what you say? He finally said. Come to my office, I'll give you the doctor's report and we'll talk about the next steps. Can you write down the address? Nick patted his jacket pockets, a gold credit card, a pack of cigarettes, a lighter, car keys in his pants, even his coat left at the club, but no notebook or pen. No, unfortunately. I'm on the street outside the Golden Glow Club. In that case, I'll send the address to you on Messenger, agreed Andrew. Nick ended the call. He took another breath of the evening air and returned indoors. He went to his table. The whiskey was no longer wanted. The glass with alcohol with a light clatter took its place on the lacquered tabletop. Why are you so gloomy? Matthew's friend's palm rested on his shoulder. Nick picked up his light gray coat from the leather couch and got dressed. Shall we go outside for a smoke? He muttered to Matthew. I'm going home. What about me, Nick? Renesmee got up from the couch. I'll take you home later or call a cab, Matthew said. You see, Nick and I need to talk. The street was still quiet and cool. The noise of cars was less and less frequent. Nick flicked on his lighter, took a deep drag. I just got a call. I told him my grandfather was dead, he said. His friend blew out the smoke thoughtfully and sighed. That's how it is. I'm sorry. Nick loved his grandfather. He scratched the back of his head. Not really, he was always pushing me with his admonition that prosperity starts with hard work. Nick waved his hand. It suited him because he'd grown up a country boy. He had different circumstances. Why would I want that? I have my parents' money. There's no one to bequeath it to, because I don't want to have children. Matthew, listening attentively to his companion, took another drag from his cigarette. Why did you become so thoughtful then? Nick looked at him. Grandfather was rich. After all, it was he who founded the chain of stores Native Nature, ecological products. You know, it's more profitable than mass market, especially for health-conscious people. My grandfather has no heirs besides me. I should inherit everything. Wow, Matthew said thoughtfully. So you're not going anywhere in life at all. You don't want to create some stable business that will work for you. It's a long life. Nick whistled nonchalantly. I have money anyway. I live and enjoy it. If it runs out, new ones will come. Or maybe they won't. I live for today, buddy. Sure, it's sad that Grandpa Vincent is dead, but I'm going to be even richer now. Why would I want to start a business? Wildlife is already a well-established business. It'll work for me anyway. Matthew chuckled and tossed his cigarette out onto the pavement. Suit yourself, buddy. Anyway, sorry about your grandfather, Matthew said. Shall I call you a cab? Nick waved his head. No, I'll do it myself. The next day, Nick picked up his own car from the club parking lot and stood in an unfamiliar courtyard surrounded by high rises. The office building with blue windows seemed to hide some secrets, not allowing to penetrate inside the curious eyes of others. And now Nick had already climbed to the 4th floor and knocked lightly with his knuckles on the door of an unnamed office number 45. Come in, it sounded from inside. Nick entered and looked around. The small room was dimly lit and not particularly richly decorated. A desk with a black office chair on wheels, upholstered brown armchairs for visitors, and a small bookcase against the wall more for looks than for use. Nick mentally chuckled. Maybe this is what a notary's office should look like. How would I know? I've never really gotten into it. At the desk sat Sam. He was not young, and on his nose sat aviator glasses like Antonov's. Those were fashionable back in my grandfather's day. Nick's mind flashed. He remembered the slippery lawyers from the TV shows his mother often watched in his childhood, so low and clerical with running eyes. He pushed the silly thoughts away. Surely now I'll learn the truth about both my grandfather and the inheritance. 2 men in black suits stood near the table. Good afternoon. I'm Nick Swan. Were you the one who called me last night? Yes, that was me. Have a seat, please. The notary pointed to the chair opposite. Nick made himself comfortable, putting his foot on his leg. He felt like a master everywhere. How can I make sure my grandfather is deceased, Sam? Sam leisurely opened the folder on the table in front of him, took out an A4 sheet and handed it to him. Here's the doctor's report. You knew your grandfather had cancer, didn't you? Nick waved his head, reading the text, but not understanding anything in it. No, I didn't know. Nick was not good at medical terms, but he did see the cause of death in black and white in the statement. I see, Nick concluded. I'll take care of my grandfather's funeral. I'll take care of it myself. But that's not the only reason you called me here, is it? He looked at the notary with interest. You're right, Sam answered. He opened the red folder again as leisurely as he had done the last time. Now he took out a large yellow envelope and opened it with a thin paper knife. He pulled out a couple of sheets of paper, stapled together. This is Vincent Swan's will, Sam said. Open for the first time in front of you and the legal witnesses. You can even check with my staff. Oh no, I don't think so. I believe it. Nick put his hands out in front of his face, read it. The notary refused, so Nick began to read it himself. Swan Vincent, being of sound mind and sound judgment, bequeaths all of his property listed below to his only begotten grandson, Swan Nick. In the event of my death, he becomes the owner of all of the following, subject to the fulfillment of a condition. It consists of Swan Nick moving permanently to my small homeland in the village of Glukhov. He must leave all his movable and immovable property acquired by inheritance from his parents, organize from scratch the work of the company in Glukhov, and earn $1 million by his own labor. If the condition is not fulfilled, all my property will become the property of the state. There was a signature below. Nick gripped the armrests and slowly rose from his chair, staring at the notary with eyes widened by the news. What he whispered. This is some kind of nonsense. The grandfather was clearly out of his mind. Are you kidding me? The document is in front of you. Nick Sam replied nonchalantly. You will receive a large inheritance, only if you fulfill the conditions. It's worth it. Your grandfather will bequeath you a 3-story house, bank accounts, and his chain of grocery stores. That's a huge company. You know there's something wrong with that, will Nick shouted. I'm not a farmer, Sam shrugged. I'm just the executor. You can read it in black and white. Nick Swan was shaking with rage. He wanted a drink, or did he? Better to get behind the wheel and drive full speed to blow off steam. He walked briskly out of the office, slamming the door forcefully behind him. Nick couldn't sleep at night. He kept thinking about his grandfather's will. How could a family man set him up like that? Although it was quite his style. Grandfather had always been annoyed by the fact that Nick didn't want to work, to learn something, to build a career and plow his own labor. Grandpa Vincent himself had grown up in the countryside, and then, after moving to the big city, had built an empire called Native Nature practically from scratch. Maybe to hell with it, Nick thought. Burn it with fire, this inheritance. After all, I still have money. I still have something to live on. What my parents who died in a car accident bequeathed me is a pretty big sum that should be enough for a few more years. It'll be whatever it takes. There's still a way out. Nick Swan never went missing. But the anxiety was taking its toll. Sleep wouldn't come, and anxious thoughts, on the contrary, crept into his head. Maybe he should check his own accounts just in case. How much was left there? Find out the exact amount. For the first time in his affluent life, he was truly worried. If there was still plenty of money, Nick could sleep well and spit on this inheritance. Maybe he would actually invest the rest of his own money in some venture, a profitable business. Perhaps it was time to settle down. The phone rang in the morning. "Nick, how are you?" Matthew's voice came over the line. "Matthew, I'll tell you everything later." Nick mumbled sleepily and dropped the call. The thought was still buzzing in his head. He needed to go to the bank. He wasn't used to putting things off until later, probably because he had almost no serious business to attend to. Already at the bank, he asked for exact details of the remaining balance. Nick asked for his account statement. When he received it, he frowned, wiped the sweat from his forehead. His heart was thumping. No way. He couldn't have spent that much money in a few years since his parents' fortune was so large. Nick started to feel bad, although maybe it had to do only with this particular bank. After all, Nick Swan had accounts at several banks around the country, but trips, new statements and facts did not make him happy. It turned out that indeed the amount that remained on his cards and accounts in the cards was quite small. What to do? Sell the property. And indeed, why not urgently sell what he has, take the money with him and go to this village Glukhov? Then he would both receive his grandfather's inheritance and save the remaining money. However, Vincent Swan had clearly described in his will that Nick should abandon all his movable and immovable property if he sells anything, even registering it to another person. These lawyers will find out. Such a danger existed. Nick tensely thought and looked for a way out. Maybe he should consult Matthew. His father is a lawyer, after all. But no one should know about these strange conditions right now. He had to think it over, weigh the pros and cons. Nick frowned all day. Matthew called twice more, but Nick glumly replied that he had no time to talk on the phone. Reynesma called once, but Swan wouldn't pick up the phone at all. What's there to do? It's a big job to get a farm up and running. Only a team of specialists could do it, and that would take a long time. And he doesn't know it half as well as he does. Not even a gram, Nick thought. First we should go to this village and see what's going on there. Maybe instead of a farm, there's just one old cow living there. Maybe it's all a fake, a silly farce, and there's some real will and not this phony will. No, he should consult a friend. Nick dialed Matthew himself. "Hi, here's the deal. I'd like to talk to you," he said. "Well, tell me about it," Matthew replied. Nick briefly told his friend about Grandpa Vincent's will and the conditions that, by fulfilling, he could inherit the estate. Matthew whistled. "Wow, what do you think you're going to do?" "I don't know," replied Nick. "I don't have that much choice, as it turns out." "Why?" a friend asked. "I made some inquiries about my accounts today. I'm running out of money, Matthew. Maybe we really should go to that Glukhov place." Matthew pondered. "It's your business, it's up to you. I don't think you have a choice either. Sure, you could invest the rest of your money somewhere, but that wouldn't be enough, would it?" "You're right," Nick sighed. Look, I'll go to this Glukhov and see with my own eyes what's going on there, whether the farm is still alive, or if there are some wastelands instead. I'll talk to the locals, and then I'll tell you all about it." The next morning, Nick did go to the village. He didn't take a driver, he drove himself. The navigator helps a lot, thought Nick. Passing the blue sign with the inscription Glukhov K, Swan felt as if he had traveled back in time. He was greeted by small houses built by the skillful hands of village men. Yards, men, roads with snow and spring slush, and most importantly, silence. Had he been here as a child? He remembers vaguely. What a village, Swan pondered. I'll survive. Village life used to seem like a different world to Nick, from his grandfather's stories, Soviet novels, and old revolutionary movies. But now it was the place where he intended to start life anew. The village, surrounded by hills with remnants of melting snow, seemed like a frozen landscape from a painting. The whole region was enveloped in the scent of fresh, incomparable spring air. This is not the way it is in the city. In the distance stretched the black abandoned fields, like deceptive promises of a rich harvest. Here the wind was in no hurry. It lazily caressed his face, making him want to breathe more deeply under its touch. Here, it seemed, was the old farm he needed to restore after his grandfather's death. As Nick moved closer to the flimsy fence, he could see last year's grass showing on the barren ground from beneath the dirty snow. Nearby was the farmhouse, in which Nick was apparently to live. The structure looked haggard, as if it were feeling neglected. Nick realized that he had a huge task before him, but it seemed so impossible now that he shuddered at the thought of it. This whole story still seemed like a terrifying dream to him. As he looked into the farmhouse, images of the past flashed before his mind's eye. His grandfather Vincent, not yet old, who had come to visit them and had spoken fondly of working in the fields despite the years and hardships. The caring tending of each cow and the sense of happiness blooming around these lands. Nick was bored and uninterested in listening to this. He wanted to have fun, play with his friends, and nothing more. Now in the present, Swan realized that the farm needed everything: new fences, restored pastures, improved equipment, and of course labor. Nick would have to lead this huge undertaking alone, but he was sure that everything was possible, if only to give this place a piece of the care that his grandfather had once given. One of the first thoughts that came to Nick's mind was to involve the locals here, not only as workers, but also as participants in the process. After all, it seemed to him that solidarity and mutual help were always highly valued in the village. Well, now it was time to make use of these valuable qualities. Nick strolled down the narrow street of the village, looking at each house. It seemed to him that these houses radiated the same, as if they were welcoming the grandson of their old friend who would never come here again. Suddenly he noticed a young, slender girl walking slowly down the path, looking into the distance. Her long blonde hair, gathered in a low ponytail, shimmered in the cold light of the spring sun like gold. The girl was dressed in black rubber boots and a dull brown jacket, from under which the hem of a homemade dress peeked out. Nick added a step and, coming closer, tried to greet her. "Where's such a beauty from, and where is she going?" he said softly, trying to smile. The girl froze for a moment in amazement at the unexpected meeting with a stranger in this wilderness. "What business is it of yours?" Finally, she answered briefly and somewhat fearfully, as if she wanted to keep her distance. "I just arrived today. My name is Nick," he continued, trying to get her attention. She frowned, as if trying to figure out what he wanted from her, and kept silent, not wanting to look unapproachable. "Don't worry, I won't hurt you," he said, trying to ease the tension. "I'm sorry if I startled you. It's my first time here. I have an errand to run. Can you tell me where I can find someone to talk to about agricultural matters?" "That way." The girl pointed to a house in the distance. "That's the board of directors. The chairman's name is Ben Smith." "Thank you." Nick smiled and looked into her clear blue eyes. "What's your name?" "Rosalee. I work here as a milkmaid." Swan grinned. "You're a milkmaid. You should be modeling, not showing off in front of cows." Rosalee looked at him incredulously. "Me? I didn't ask you for advice. I have nothing to discuss with you. I'm in a hurry." Nick decided not to insist, realizing that with his assertive attention he only pushed the stranger away, and nodded with understanding. Country girls aren't like city beauties. Their straightforwardness can also offend, he thought. He walked on, deciding that he just needed time to understand the local customs and learn how to communicate so as not to cause awkwardness again. Finally, Nick found himself in front of the house where Rosalee had said the village board was located. In the room, an elderly man sat at a table, above which hung a large portrait of the president in a wooden frame. He looked at the entering guest with the look of a host. That was Ben Smith. "Good afternoon." Nick said hello as he entered the house. "My name is Nick Swan. My grandfather used to live in this village, and he put me in charge of some business. I've come to talk to you," Nick continued. "I was told that you could help with the farm." "Good afternoon," answered Ben Smith, raising his eyes from the papers. "What exactly can I do to help?" Nick began to explain again that he was the grandson of Vincent Swan, who used to live here and own this farm, that he had gone to the city when he was young, started a big business there, and had died the other day, bequeathing a request to rebuild the farm. "To be honest, I don't know anything about these things," Nick sighed. "I need your help." Ben Smith listened attentively, then spoke. "I remember Uncle Vincent. He taught us boys to swim, to drive a tractor, to plow fields. He was old enough to be my father. The whole village respected him for his hard work. I'm glad to meet his grandson." He put his hand across the table to Nick, and he shook it. Ben Smith told me about the farm's problems. Of course, in a nutshell, it was as Nick had anticipated: a shortage of labor, machinery, and competent people who could negotiate supplies to the stores. "What exactly should be done to restore the farm?" Nick persisted. "How can I help personally, given that now I have no finances?" The conversation became more and more serious, and Nick realized that he was waiting for difficult trials and difficult decisions. But in his heart, strangely enough, he felt that he was ready to accept his grandfather's challenge. "The main thing is to attract more employees," Ben Smith began. "If you have connections, you can bring labor to the village, more grain. We don't have much in the way of supplies. All the locals have their own vegetable gardens, and everyone grows produce for their own use. They all work for us, but there aren't enough people. There's no profit. Consequently, their wages are small. And on a farm, you need a well-coordinated working team, like a real family. We need a friendly atmosphere, like in Soviet collective farms, you know. In general, we have a poor environment. Machines, of course, are necessary for cultivation, for transportation of land, tools, crops. Cattle yard, we also do not have a very large. The key to a successful farm is healthy animals," said Ben Smith. They need regular veterinary checkups, proper feeding and care. Just like in business, if you want to make a profit, you have to invest first. I'll think about what you're saying, Nick replied. Tell me, does anyone live in my grandfather's former house now? A family used to live there. They left a year ago, and now the house is empty. Can I stay there for a while? Of course, Ben nodded. And stepping inside the rustic farmhouse, Nick instantly felt the atmosphere of abandonment. Forgotten thick dust, like an impenetrable shroud, enveloped the surfaces and every object in the room. The decrepit things on the floor or on the old wooden shelving units seemed frozen in time, reflecting years past. The old boards creaked underfoot, their surface seeming riddled with time and the marks of past occupants. Nick's great-grandmother, great-grandfather and grandfather had once lived here, simple and humble people who worked on the farm and built their happy future. But over time, life on this land changed, and the grandfather had to leave. He built a business in the capital, nevertheless managing the supply of goods from successful farms all over the country. Agriculture was forever in his heart. The furniture in the house also showed signs of former life, the table and chairs where they used to gather in the evenings, telling stories and sharing joys. The old but reliable cupboard where they cooked delicious meals and stored supplies for the winter. One could also see traces of the last occupants, the village people who had been interloping here for some time. The bed was made up with a rather new-looking colorful blanket, benches by the window, and books left on the table, as if the occupants were about to return and continue their daily routine. Inside the house there was a silence that only emphasized the silent history of the place. Once upon a time there had been life here, laughter and voices, but now it was as if everything was frozen. But in every rustle and creak of the floorboards, the spirit of bygone times could be traced, reminding him that once there had been real life here. Nick wondered. He had never been interested in how people who lived different lifestyles from his rich metropolitan life lived, what they were interested in, what they were passionate about, how they supported themselves. Now life had brought Swan to this world that was new to him. Nick had spent long hours all day lying on the sprung rustic bed and thinking carefully over every word he had heard from Ben Smith. A plan had to be made and action had to be taken, but where to find the right people? Good thing he had Sam's support, willingness to learn and eagerness to create something new waiting for him on this journey to rebuild the farm. So here goes. By nightfall, Nick Swan already had further plans. Once the people and machinery were in place, to focus on introducing new technology and farming methods to make the operation more efficient and environmentally friendly. He dreamed of seeing this farm as a model of sustainable farming, where not only crops thrive, but nature itself. Thus began his journey. The next day, with the help of Ben Smith, Nick organized a meeting for all the villagers, gathering them in the small hall of the local school. Dear villagers, Nick began, standing in front of the audience with a determined expression on his face. My name is Nick Swan. I am the grandson of Vincent Petrovich Swan, who lived and worked in this village. Today, I would like to discuss with you the important matter of restoring your farm. We all know that it was an important source of income for our ancestors, and I believe we can restore it to its former glory. A few voices in the room nodded supportively, and some expressed their doubts. I understand your doubts, Nick continued, taking a deep breath. We don't know where to get grain, equipment, additional workers, but we know that each of you has your own plots of land and your own seeds for sowing. I suggest we each contribute a small portion of seed for general sowing on the farm. We'll even draw up a contract if you like, Nick continued. Remember, after the revolution, collective farms were formed all over the country. It might be worth a try, don't you think? Our goal is to ensure profit, prosperity for all villagers, and even to reach not only local stores and markets, but also to supply the big cities. There were whispers and objections in the hall. What if something goes wrong? Will we lose our own crops? How will we be able to agree to share farm machinery? They won't let us, Nick. It's complicated. We can't rebuild the farm that quickly. Nick smiled and said with confidence, I realize that this is a task that will require a joint effort and agreement. I promise to enter into farm equipment leasing arrangements with other businesses to help us. We can agree on profit sharing according to the contribution of each participant. We need to work together to succeed. You do realize that there will be double or triple profit from the sales in the stores. Several villagers, inspired by Nick's speech, began discussing ways to increase dairy production and find new employees for the farm. A spark of hope erupted in the hall. When the meeting was over, the villagers dispersed. Nick, ignoring the others, made his way to Rosalee, who was standing by the door. Rosalee, I'm glad you came too. Maybe we could take a walk, get to know each other better. You're beautiful, he said, trying to attract attention. Rosalee turned away, and with a little irony in her voice replied, Nick, you're a city rich guy. I don't know you at all. Maybe you're used to talking nice, but in reality you're worthless. I'm not rich, Nick objected. Now I've started from scratch in this village of yours. You just don't know everything. Nick felt a prick of disappointment. He was used to women's attention and easy flirting. and he hadn't expected such a reaction from Rosalee. Before, he had thought that a simple country girl was easier to charm with the capital's glamour. But he didn't want to tell the truth, either. To confess to Rosalee that he had never worked and had squandered all his parents' inheritance would be to make himself look bad. Nick tried to smile and say something, but Rosalee had already turned and left. He stood alone, staring after Rosalee. In his heart, he was determined to prove to her that he could do as well as talk. Rebuilding the farm was his priority, and profit for everyone in the village was a promise he hoped to fulfill. For a month, Nick has been busy trying to get at least some equipment from the administration to till and sow the soil, but the regional center, to which the village belonged, turned out to be very unfriendly. There was a rigid bureaucracy, which resulted in huge queues and all sorts of reasons for refusal, because there were quite a lot of businessmen asking. Nick himself was acting on behalf of the village board to start his own enterprise. He didn't have the funds yet. He feared violating the terms of his grandfather's will, and taking the remaining money from New York lawyers were checking his accounts daily. But the effort was not in vain. Nick had pulled up his connections. The will did not forbid it, since Swan himself did not run any business. Many serious companies would not grant him benefits, much less on trust. So it was necessary to ask his distinguished acquaintances to vouch for him and arrange for the leasing of farm machinery themselves, either on lease or at future interest. The loan required little to begin with. With the help of the chairman and the village staff, Nick made a list of what was needed and attached it to the requests. With the help of connections, things started to move forward, and Nick had to promise everyone a future profit. But inside himself, he feared going into debt for a long time. He didn't know how to run a business, and there were no mentors, but he had access to the internet. Swan read articles on agricultural websites every day, scrutinizing modern ways of getting a good harvest and caring for livestock. There were cows in the village, but they needed to increase their litter and milk yields. In addition, more milkmaids had to be hired. In addition to Rosalee, there were 3 other women working here. Job search websites were an invaluable resource for finding experienced milkers and other staff to join the team. By contracting for feed on credit, Nick provided the necessary nutrition for the cows. Throughout the spring, work was already well underway in the fields in the village. The soil had warmed to the optimum temperature and was ready for sowing. Plowing, fertilizing, planting, and tending the seeds began. As soon as the sown crops sprouted, a period of more active care began, including weeding, watering, and pest and disease control. Now Nick was convinced personally the cohesion of the villagers and their willingness to help in a common cause is not a myth, but a reality. If it wasn't for the faith of all these people in him, nothing would have been possible. Just like that, from scratch. Nick's next step was to negotiate with wholesalers for grain, milk, and dairy products. He wanted to establish long-term partnerships, but not only production, but also commercial and marketing strategies were needed. Again, he had to use his contacts, calling on New York acquaintances in the trading business. It was necessary to pay salaries to employees after the first sales. All this time, Nick repeatedly tried to talk to Rosalee and get to know her better. He was interested in understanding her better and establishing a close relationship, but it was not easy to pave the way, because Rosalee was still reserved and unavailable. She felt the need for trust and understanding, but saw in Nick only a potential player. The chance meeting at an old bog near the field changed everything. It was the beginning of summer, but the morning was cool and the dawn illuminated the surrounding nature beautifully. The girl had already had time to milk her cows and was now returning. "Good morning, Rosalee." Nick waved his hand and came closer. "Look how beautiful it is in the sky, and even in the marsh. It's as if nature had given us a fairy tale," he said, pointing to the still water that played with the reflection of the morning sunlight. Rosalee nodded. "Yes, it's beautiful at dawn. I always go to milk the cows at 5 a.m. when the sun rises. And now there is even more work to do on the farm," she replied, smiling and watching the play of light on the water. "Tired?" Nick asked sympathetically. The girl shrugged her shoulders. "A little." Now that the opportunity presented itself, Nick didn't know what exactly to talk to Rosalee about. They were from different worlds, but he was irresistibly drawn to her. "You probably think I'm uneducated. There's nothing to talk to me about," Rosalee said, as if she'd read his mind. "No, really. I don't have a very prestigious job, but I love to read. My grandmother used to bring me books from the city." It was a moment of true bonding, a moment when Nick felt that the time would come, and they would be able to talk about many things. Despite smiling and talking more openly, Rosalee still didn't trust Nick completely. She had a hard time accepting his sincere intentions because of his past careless life. Nick felt this wall of distrust because even in casual conversations, he could sense how Rosalee carefully guarded her personal space. "Rosalee, I truly value our communication. I don't want to embarrass you or cause you any doubt. I just want you to know that I value your opinion, your support." "And I mean that sincerely," Nick said, looking into her eyes with a sudden warmth inside. "Nick, it's nice to hear that, but you realize that I take the subject of love very seriously. I don't want mistakes and breakups and pain. I don't want uncertainty and games, but sometimes I think I want to trust you." "I don't know what to think about that," Rosalee replied, trying to express her complicated feelings. This conversation was an important step in their relationship. Nick began to realize that behind that reserved mask was a vulnerable soul in need of true understanding and real, honest manly care. Nick realized that to achieve trust and acceptance of Rosalee, he needed to give her time and show his continued support regardless of her decision. Sometimes feelings require patience. They began to take more frequent walks together, choosing to do so at dawn or dusk, when nature around them was calm and there was no rush to get anywhere. One day, when they were sitting in a field, watching the sun set over the horizon, Rosalee suddenly turned to Nick. "You know, Nick, I really appreciate your sincerity and your concern. This is a new one for me. You gave me your time and gave me your support without asking for anything in return. I agree that we need to get to know each other better, but let's not be in a hurry. I hope you understand me," Rosalee said, smiling slightly. The smile adorned her freckles. Her face and bright eyes glistened, reflecting the first rays of sunlight. At that moment, Nick really wanted to kiss her, but he realized that it wasn't time yet. He could see that despite all the obstacles, something special was beginning to brew between them, just so long as he didn't scare the feeling away. He promised himself to put in all his efforts to earn the love of this simple, yet so special girl. Nick and Rosalee, without noticing it, became the heroes of their own fairy tale, what made them open new chapters in their lives. Quite often his friend in the oven was visited by Matthew. Each time, driving by in his luxurious Mercedes, he brought Nick sets of expensive products, cigarettes, elite wine or whiskey. It was not forbidden and was considered just a friendly gift from Matthew. Swan had asked for favors too. Surely he must have acquaintances in agriculture, wholesale groceries or advertising. Matthew kept fervently promising to find out, to help, to ask around, but in the end it all ended with a phone call. And it began with a bleak side look. "Nick, I'm sorry, it's just a thing." It didn't work out, Nick shrugged, because it wasn't Matthew's fault. Apparently, he just had the wrong connections. Nevertheless, communication and persuasion were Swan's great qualities, and now they were more useful than ever. He continued to travel to businesses, advertising companies, negotiate, could promise super profits, knowing full well that he risked undermining trust. But some companies did sign contracts with him, and Nick was happy. He even chuckled in the back of his mind. To think, if someone had told him earlier that he would be so happy about being a farmer, he would have raised the interlocutor to laughter in front of everyone. It's amazing how radically life changes sometimes. Grain and milk were hauled to wholesalers by 2 truckloads, a bit of transportation to be sure, and several runs were required. But Swan was glad he could get them at least. 1 cow was expecting a litter. Nick was already starting to make future plans for a meat supply, but that would require buying more cattle. Surely the first profit had to be made first and the employees had to be paid off, just as long as everything continued at the same pace. Nick was now more confident that he would be able to earn $1 million from the farms by the end of the year and receive his grandfather's inheritance, and then it would be up to him. So far, Nick Swan was on track, but it is seldom the case that what is planned for a long period of time comes to pass smoothly and without interference. It wasn't long after the first bulk shipments. Nick went to the city for another negotiation. On his return to Glukhov, he saw Rosalee from afar, who anxiously walked back and forth near his house. Nick turned off the engine and got out of the car. The girl ran up to him, and he paid attention to her excitement. "What's the matter?" Nick asked. An anxious premonition had already lost its soul. "Nick, the cow is missing." "Martha," the guy raised his eyebrows in surprise. "How disappeared? Who in a small village could steal a cow? Maybe it was tied up badly." There were tears in the milkmaid's eyes. "I tied her up myself. She couldn't have gotten away." Nick opened the car door again. "Get in. Let's go to the barn," Nick said. Rosalee climbed into the spacious cabin. She had never ridden in such luxurious and expensive cars before, but now she was in the wrong mood to savor such an opportunity. Anxiety for the cow and thoughts of theft occupied her mind. Rosalee was only afraid of dirtying the light-colored upholstery of the seat with her work clothes. Arriving at the site, Nick anxiously looked around the farm, trying to detect any signs of strange happenings. What are these strange happenings? Everything was so suspicious. What had been happening here in his absence? Why had the cow's disappearance gone unnoticed by the milkmaid and the field workers? So, most likely the cow had been stolen during the night. The man's anxiety increased when he discovered footprints near the barn. Of course, they could have been the shoe prints of the locals. He also saw wheel marks. It was understandable trucks came here every day to load the goods, but one human footprint led towards the forest. "What a strange business this farm has started," Nick muttered, crossing his arms over his chest and staring off into the distance. Then he absent-mindedly patted his pockets for cigarettes, pulled out a pack, flicked his lighter, and it burst into a long orange-blue flame. "Nick, I remember something," Rosalee said timidly. "Maybe it has something to do with the missing, but I'm not sure." Nick exhaled smoke. "Rosalee, we're in a position where it's better to tell everything you think is suspicious. I saw some guy the other day. He wasn't one of ours, I know he wasn't. He was hanging around the fence or near the barn. Another time the girls saw him loitering near the trucks. Swan stirred and looked at the girl intently. What did he look like? The milkmaid hesitated, remembering faces. I didn't see his face. It felt like this guy didn't want to be seen. He was wearing jeans and a black hoodie. A lot of young people dress like that nowadays. The man kept his hands in his pockets and his head hidden under a hood. Nick began to remember, but could not recognize any of his acquaintances from this description. Nick used to be in the highest circles of the capital, and all his entourage wore only branded clothes of classic style and so-called old manny images. All evening Nick walked from corner to corner, or sat at the table and smoked. The lone hooded figure that Rosalee had informed him about kept the man on his toes. His gut told him that the figure had something to do with the strange events at the farm. It was time to get to the bottom of this unexpected mystery. Nick stood up. We must find out where the tracks led. If they are washed away by the rain, we'll miss some important clue. He felt the need to see Rosalee again. Nick went to her house. After a few months, he was already navigating the streets of Glover so easily, knowing every house and every inhabitant so well, that he felt as if he had lived in this village for years. Hey, if I had the money, I'd buy some chickens for the farm and have the streets paved, he thought. But how? Any thoughts? Swan asked Rosalee as they walked leisurely from her gate toward the barn. Not really, she shrugged her shoulders. We'll have to solve this mystery with our neighbors. Let's ask them, maybe someone knows this man. I'm more and more sure that there is a connection between this stranger and the missing cow, Swan said thoughtfully. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp ringing of the telephone. Hello? Yes, it's me. What? When did this happen? Thanks for the call. Nick interrupted the conversation, turned to Rosalee. Ben called. He told me that from afar, near the field, saw a man with the description you gave. He said the man was looking suspiciously around the village. Rosalee noticed Nick's steady gaze toward the woods. Nick, do you think we should go there to look for Martha? Maybe we should. Look from here, there are footprints in that direction. The villagers often go there. Rosalee was surprised and waved her hands. What nonsense. What is there to do in the forest? You can't even get to the neighboring village. It's on the other side. Nevertheless, someone went there. Look. Nick stopped at the cowshed and pointed at the ground. Did he carry the cow on his back? The milkmaid said skeptically. Where are the traces of the animal? Nick scratched the back of his head. Indeed, the conclusions were simple. Martha was well tethered and could not leave on her own. No one could have led her away, either, for there were no fresh hoofprints beyond the barn. There was only one option: the cow was taken away by car. Nick snapped his fingers, as he always did when he thought of something important. So, we'd better check where the farm trucks were. The trucks were parked where they were. Work for the day due to the missing cow had also stopped. Eden called out to one of the drivers standing by the cab. Hey, Nick, when was the last time you drove out? Yesterday? He answered, a little surprised what's to ask. Everyone already saw that I was taking the goods away. Andrew, I think, too. Where is he? Eden waved his hand. Sleeping at home. Said he had a headache. All right, get some rest. Nick went back to Rosalee. Listen, I still want to see where this trail leads. Perhaps the man went far into the thicket, so you decide whether you go with me or not. I have to find out where these unknown footprints lead anyway. Even if it wasn't the man who stole the cow, he may be connected to the one who did. Are you with me? Of course, the girl answered without a shadow of doubt. They went to look for the supposed place of the stranger's last stay. Both Nick and Rosalee were already sure that these were the tracks of the guy in the sweatshirt, or those with whom he was in league. They walked on, and thin branches snapped beneath their feet, and the green network of the tall trees' crowns, like lace, let the sun's rays pass through, which lay in fanciful patterns on the ground in front of them. The trail did take them far into the forest and broke off. Here a man had stopped, stomped, perhaps squatted, and, judging by the imprints in the damp earth, turned back. So here, in this place, there might be some clue. Not far away, they saw the broken branches of a bush, like a signpost, and a small mound, like a man-made hill, the kind children make out of sand. Nick began digging with determination, hoping to find something meaningful. Suddenly, his fingers felt cold metal, a hidden key. Rosalee, look what I found, Nick exclaimed, barely containing his excitement. A key. But what is this key? What is it for? And who might need it? Rosalee said thoughtfully. Her gaze traveled through the forest, as if searching for answers among the old trees. There was no one else here but the two of them. Of course, she felt safe with Nick, but still she felt shivers running down her spine from this unfamiliar atmosphere and the unknown. Nick resolutely took the key with him. They went around and examined the nearest thickets and forest glades, but they could not find anything else. Tired from the long walk with heavy steps, Nick and Rosalee headed back. The gentle rays of the sun were still shining through the green crowns, creating a marvelous play of light and shadow. The air was saturated with the smell of fresh leaves and life-giving moisture enveloping the forest. Whatever problems and affairs people had, nature lived its life, unhurried, observing the eternal rhythm and change of day and night and seasons. Suddenly, Rosalee tripped over some root. A sharp pain pierced her ankle, which had twisted awkwardly from the awkward movement. The girl cried out and almost fell. Nick, concerned about her condition, immediately supported the girl. "Hold on to me. That's it, good." He carefully led, limping, his companion to a fallen tree trunk. "You need to sit down, and I'll see what's wrong with your leg." The milkmaid frowned. "There, no help from me. I'm only in your way." He took the girl's hand in his and shook it gently. Then he looked into Rosalee's eyes of utter confusion. "Don't worry. It's going to be okay," Nick whispered, smiling. "I'm here with you. It's just a minor annoyance that will end." Rosalee looked at him gratefully and smiled back at him too. It was as if her heart was filling up as described in novels and poems. She felt the feeling of gratitude and appreciation for Nick Swan begin to turn into something more, but she was afraid to call it love. Nick, looking at Rosalee, was experiencing his own inner storm. His heart beat harder and his breathing became heavier. Despite the problems, the world around Rosalee was becoming brighter and more beautiful. But Nick was also in no hurry to confess his feelings, not knowing how the girl would feel about it. "Nick, thank you for supporting me," Rosalee said thoughtfully, tucking a strand of hair out of her braid behind her ear. "You're different, you know. You've changed so much since we first met." Nick grinned affectionately, a twinkle in his eye. "For better or for worse? For me, I'd say for the better." "Of course it is," Rosalee answered. "When I saw you then on the road, I knew at once that you were a city major, a pathetic rich man of those who are often reported in the secular chronicles. People like us, simple villagers, and do not know. I was Nick, remembered. My parents left me an inheritance, and I did something stupid. I didn't start my own business, didn't continue my parents' business, just spending until I had very little left." Rosalee rested her head on his shoulder. "And then?" she asked. "And then my grandfather died. That's the same Uncle Vincent the old people here know. He grew up in this village, then went to the city and started a business. Have you heard of the Native Nature grocery store chain?" "I think so. It's for the rich." Rosalee nodded. "It's just that their products are organic, produced under certain conditions. That's the difference with regular stores. Certificates, all that stuff." Rosalee looked up. "And our city doesn't have the right environmental conditions." Nick Swan suddenly froze, caught up in a new idea. "It's a good place," he said. "It's something to think about in the future." Nick winked at Rosalee and stood up. "Try a step. If you can't walk, I'll carry you." With every word, every moment spent together, their bond grew stronger and deeper. He carried her through the forest in his arms, and Rosalee suddenly realized that Nick was already the closest and dearest person to her. In his eyes, she saw everything she had always dreamed of, and now she couldn't imagine life without him. But what if he didn't share her feelings? Nick, in turn, felt his heart fill with warmth and happiness. Next to Rosalee, he respected her strength and determination, but at the same time longed to protect her from pain and misfortune. He realized it was more than just friendship. Under the gentle drops of summer rain, Swan slowly made his way through the forest with the girl in his arms, each step bringing him closer to his village, to his home. Rosalee was already walking on her own feet, supported under Nick's arm. The girl was embarrassed that Swan had carried her for so long, and she worried that the boy was tired. Nick helped Rosalee to sit down on the bed. "Shall I call you a doctor?" he asked. "No, I don't need to," Rosalee replied, smiling. "You seem to have shortness of breath. Go about your business, everything will be fine." Nick made up his mind. He suddenly kissed the girl gently on the cheek. He did it so quickly that Rosalee had no time to react, and just as quickly went out. The important thing was to find the owner of the key and the lock it opened. The best solution was to question the locals. Maybe one of them had noticed it missing. Swan decided to start with Ben. The chairman was twirling the key in his hands. "No identifying marks, just a lanyard," he said. "Just an ordinary key. Mute, that's for sure." Nick lit a cigarette, thinking, "Look, Ben, what could it be for, this key? To the house, to the barn, to the farm sheds, or anything at all? Can Nick get us past the neighbors?" Swan grinned skeptically. "Do you think anyone would admit to being involved in a theft?" Ben dismissed it. "Well, what if that key was also stolen from someone unrelated to the case?" Nick scratched his head. "What a detective. Nothing to say," he grinned. At first, the questioning of the local population led to nothing. Only the driver, Eden, when the turn came to him, turned the key in his wide fingers and shouted, perplexed. "So my truck has such a key. It's not mine, look, Nick, mine is in the truck." The driver went to the truck. Nick and Ben followed him. Eden opened the door and climbed into the cab, pointing to the dashboard. "Here it is, my key, I'll start it now. The engine's running." "Shut it off, Eden," Ben shouted. Eden switched off the engine and jumped back to the ground to the interlocutors. "And you ask Andrew?" "The other driver. Maybe he's the one who lost it." right? Thanks, Eden, Nick clapped the man on the shoulder. Silence rang around the aforementioned Andrew's house, the same one where the knock on the door returned from the room outside, quietly echoing that the owner wasn't home. Nick's suspicion was growing. They returned to the garage, where no one else was there. The truck was parked there. The second one. Swan jumped into the cab, put the key in. The truck roared to life, ready to move. That's the number, Ben said. Listen, Nick, turn off the engine and get downstairs. No one can know we were here. We'll wait until Andrew gets back and I'll talk to him. In the meantime, I've got an idea. I'll go to the neighboring villages. Maybe that's where the cow was hidden. That's right, said Ben, brightening up. I'll go with you, hurry up. At Ben's, whose wife treated Nick to fried potatoes with homemade pickles, the men went on a trip to a neighboring village. Some of the villagers were surprised at their expensive automobile and strange search because none of them had seen any cow. They asked permission to look around the barns and stable, mentioning that there had been a theft, which meant that the police would soon be here. People voluntarily let them into the farm to show that they were really uninvolved in the crime. The far shed was locked. Nick and Ben knocked for a long time on the door of the apartment building next to that small structure. Finally, the door creaked open and a young man stepped out of the house. His appearance suggested the conclusion that he had been drinking a lot of alcohol. What do you want? Who are you? He asked. Nick explained that he was investigating a missing cow and demanded that the barn be opened for inspection. The guy was scared. I'll be right back. You'll forgive me, I'll tell you everything in confidence. He waved his hands. With shaking hands, the owner opened the barn, and the men found in it the missing cow Martha, who had caused so much trouble and interrupted the work of the milkmaids and the milk supply. We're listening to you, Ben began sternly. Don't lie, the police will check it out. No, I won't lie, the boy waved his hands. My name is Benjamin Bold. A guy brought in a cow the other day and asked me to watch the barn. He gave me money, said he'd take it back soon. Who's the guy? The owner waved his hand. A city boy. A hitchhiker, black glasses and a black hooded sweatshirt. Why hitchhike? Well, he's rich, expensive watch. You could see it from the sleeve. What's his name? I don't know. I didn't ask. Nick started tying up the cow. You got a truck? He asked. I do, but I was drunk last night. You give me the keys and I'll drive, Ben said. I gotta get the cow back. You ride with me in the cab, and then you can drive back on your own. All right. Soon the valuable find named Martha was on its way to the village. Nick drove ahead of the truck in his car. Suddenly, just before the village, he noticed the figure of a man. He was coming out of the woods exactly the same way he and Rosalee had recently followed the unknown tracks. Nick stopped the car. Taking a closer look, he got out, waved to the truck. Ben leaned out of the cab. What's up? Ben, who's that coming? Nick asked, looking in the distance. That's our driver, Andrew, the one you knocked on. I don't know what he was doing in those woods. Nick jumped back into his car and started the engine. He drove closer to where the man was. Andrew, is that you, Nick? He was surprised. Why did you go to the city? Were you at the wholesale base? Well, yes. Get in. I'll give you a ride to the village, Nick answered. Thanks. Andrew sat down on the next seat. Nick noted the puzzled look of his traveling companion. He did not ask questions, for fear of causing premature panic in his companion. Nick's plan was to observe Andrew's further actions without letting him out of his sight. He was curious what steps the unlucky driver would take when he discovered the key was missing, and it was also important to wait, in case the executor would lead to the one who was behind the whole theft. Andrew, your help will be needed. Nick spoke up. There's something we need to take, and we've delayed deliveries. Yeah, sure, Andrew replied doomily. Nick understood his despondency. The driver was probably puzzled because he couldn't find the keys to his truck. The only thing left to find out was why that key was in the woods. Arriving in California, Nick immediately drove Andrew home, asking him to come back to the garage in an hour. Andrew nodded doomedly. In the meantime, Ben delivered Martha back to the barn. Dana, the milkmaid on duty, was very excited, but preferred not to ask the chairman any unnecessary questions. They would tell her everything at the meeting, and if not, she could gossip with her friends. Soon the cow was fed and milked. The cattle were well cared for here. In an hour, Nick had time to talk with Ben about further actions and to visit Rosalee. The girl was incredibly happy that it was possible to find and return the missing cow. I'll go to the farm right away, she said, forgetting her sore leg. But when she stood up, she grimaced at the pain and sat down on the bed again. Rosalee, please stay home tonight. Dana will take care of Martha, and you rest and recuperate. I have a lot to do. I think I've got a lead. Now I just need to unravel the whole thing. I'll tell you all about it when I'm sure. An hour later, Andrew was waiting in the garage. When he saw Nick, he walked toward him. Nick, what happened? Swan asked. The thing is, I lost the keys to the truck. I've turned the whole house upside down, the whole garage. I can't find them. Andrew shook his head. That's a shame. When was the last time you drove out? Over 24 hours ago. Do you have a duplicate of your key? No, there was only one. Nobody else drives my truck but me. Nick pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. Hello, it's Swan coming up from the garage. I'm waiting for you. He put the phone away again and looked encouragingly at Andrew. We'll be right there. Ben and a few other neighbors from the village soon arrived on the scene. Their chairman had brought witnesses with him. Nick leaned over and touched the truck's rear tire. More than 24 hours, you say? He interrogated the driver ironically, showing a hand stained with road grime. It had been raining lightly since tonight. The asphalt dries quickly, but that mud on the wheel stays if you drive off-road. This is about the kind of mud we drove through today from the village of Svetlitsa, where the stolen cow was discovered. After a few seconds of evening silence, the neighbors asked questions. Is that you, Andrew? Why did you steal the cow? Andrew waved his hands, trying to justify himself. I didn't steal the cow, guys. I didn't need it. Anyway, I lost the keys to the truck. The thief who stole the truck probably has it. I was sleeping in my house, I swear. Nick slipped his hand into his pants pocket and slowly pulled out a piece of metal that glinted in the lantern light. You mean this key, Andrew? The driver recognized his shoelace. Nick, what about you? Why him? Andrew opened his mouth sluggishly, unable to string two words together out of confusion. I found him, Nick said. Andrew found where you couldn't. In the woods, in the designated spot. Look, if you keep denying it, I'm going to have to call the police. This isn't just stealing a cow. This is deliberate sabotage to stop the farm working. You gave the key to someone. The driver stood with his head down guiltily. He realized it was useless to resist any further. It was more serious than just handing over the key. If the police were involved, it was better to tell the whole truth. I'm sorry, Nick, Andrew said. Come on, tell me. Chairman Ben rushed him. Nick sighed. A man came up to me the other day. Not from around here, city folk? Expensive car, black, asked me if I wanted to make a lot of money all at once. Well, I got curious. Tell me about it, I told him. This guy suggested I walk and talk on the road. Exactly on the way to that place in the woods where you, Nick, were today? Ben was curious. What next? Nick continued. That's where this man asked me to rent a truck for one trip. He offered me a lot of money. I was against it, wanted to refuse at first. How could I trust a stranger with my car? Then the guy introduced himself as David and said he'd return the truck, but he'd leave his gold watch as collateral. It's worth more than the old truck, so I agreed. Only he could not show himself in the village, and we agreed that we would give him the keys and the watch, hiding them there, in the agreed place. I could use the money. Why David needed the truck, I didn't ask. Nick frowned. Now, some unknown David is implicated in the theft. And can you describe this man, Andrew? The driver nodded. He was about your height, thin, dark-haired, eyes hidden under dark glasses. Even in, he was dressed in jeans and a black hoodie. It's him again, exclaimed the chairman. Wait a minute, Swan interrupted him. A lot of people are talking about the watch. Andrew, what did the watch look like? A gold one, I think, said Andrew. It had an interesting strap, as if it were made of several thin chains. I haven't even seen one of those on TV, Swan said, mumbling thoughtfully. Yeah, it's probably a designer thing. Suddenly he froze. There was a man among his acquaintances, a real fanatic for exclusive accessories. Nick had once said with a laugh that a great designer had died in this man, but no, it just couldn't be. Now I've lost my job at the farm? Andrew asked glumly. Wait, let me deal with the case first. Nick stopped him. Just tell me, did this supposed David leave his number for contact or something? No, Andrew answered. He returned the truck to the garage at night, but he didn't go through the village to my house with the key. Otherwise he would have been spotted. He left the key in the agreed place, but you found it first. That's all. If I remember anything about this guy, I'll let you know. Nick turned to the chairman. I've got to go into town in the morning. I've got some urgent business to attend to. You know, I may have to use my money in the capital to investigate this case. What if I have to bribe someone? But more on that later. I want to tell you the most important thing. He looked around at the villagers who were nearby at that moment. I could lose my grandfather's inheritance for violating the conditions. Nick continued. There was a time when that inheritance was more important to me than anything else in the world. I didn't want to achieve anything. I didn't know how to breathe. I only enjoyed a life of luxury. But the last years changed me, turned me around 180 degrees. I had no idea that this farm of yours would become so important to me. Then Nick noticed how to the people listening to him, limping, came Rosalee. I felt I was needed here, he continued. Needed not because of my money, but because for the first time in my life I was able to organize something really important for all of us. I also learned for the first time what it means to care about someone. So even if I lose my grandfather's inheritance, I promise you that I will come back here," Nick continued. "I will continue to raise the farm. We can't do much yet, but in time there will be chickens, pigs. You'll help me organize, because this is the important business of life now, friends." "How well you talk, Nick." Rosalee came up to him. "I believe in you. I think the whole village believes in you. Don't you, Nick?" "We'll help for sure," came the voices. At this moment, Nick Swan, former Capital's rich man and formerly a wealthy heir, could not explain what he felt. But these emotions warmed him so cozily from inside that the warmth overwhelmed the man, and he wanted to share it with the whole world. All night, Nick did not sleep. He reflected on how many events had managed to happen to him since the beginning of this spring. It hadn't been easy, but he was coping. The only thing that was unclear to Swan was why the man who called himself David would want to pull a stunt like that with the cow and try to stop him, but he would find out. In the capital, Nick went to the head office of his late grandfather Vincent Swan's corporation. He met with his lawyers. "I'd like to find out how long I still have to fulfill the conditions to receive the inheritance," Nick said. "The $1 million my grandfather demanded. I earned from wholesale grain and milk shipments, from renting 2 fields. Yes, it took time, but I have all the documents and income tax returns in hand." The lawyers looked at each other. "What kind of firm? Village?" Nick clarified and suddenly tensed up. The lawyers didn't seem to understand what they were talking about. "Tell me, do you have a copy of your grandfather's will? It says everything. I saw the original at the notary's office and held it myself." "The original is here," said one of the men present. A young man in a gray business suit opened the safe in the office, took out a yellow folder, and turned to Swan. "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Steve Karev, new notary. I was recently hired by the manager of the Nasher Home Corporation. When I was handed over the files, I was told that you had long been notified of the inheritance and had the will read in front of witnesses," Steve Karev said. "I waited for you, but you never showed up here and never took possession. Later I made inquiries and found out that you were out of town." "But it was so," answered the surprised Nick. "After my grandfather's funeral, the notary called me. I went to him, he read me the will, the conditions." "What terms?" Steve didn't understand. Nick patiently told. "This is not the time to be annoyed. It is necessary to get to the truth." Steve Karev opened a folder and took out a document from there, signed and sealed. "Read it, Nick. It's the original will." Nick Swan read and could not believe his eyes. It seemed to him that with each line he was getting more and more covered with cold sweat. It was just like the first time, only in reverse. Now Nick was possessed not by shock, but by just anger. Being of sound mind and sound judgment, Vincent Swan bequeathed all of his movable and immovable property, all of his assets, accounts, and affairs to his only legitimate grandson, Nick Swan, and that was without conditions. Unable to cope with his emotions, Nick dropped the paper from his hands. The nimble notary immediately picked it up and folded it neatly back into the folder. "The will that was read to you was a fake. What was the name of the notary who called you? Sam?" Steve Karev sat down at his computer. He clicked the mouse for a few seconds, opening the database, ran his eyes over it, then shook his head. "That's what I thought. There's no such thing in the database. It was to someone's advantage to trick you into not seeing the real will." Swan Nick crossed his arms over his chest. "I already know who. I just don't know why. Maybe my grandfather has other close relatives besides me." "I don't know about kinship," said an elderly lawyer who had been in business with his grandfather. "But just before Vincent Peters died, a fellow came to see him. Just as your grandfather and I were reviewing the new contracts, he came out and demanded to speak to him alone. Vincent refused to talk. All he said was he'd help the guy if he had to. But officially, legally, only Nick could be the heir, period. That's what he said." Nick, the young man, then jumped out of the office in anger. Nick couldn't believe his ears. So that notary and his witnesses were masquerades, hired actors who had been paid to read him a fake will. "It appears so," said the lawyer. "I think so, too," confirmed the notary Steve Karev. "In that case," Nick thought, "I need your help in one case." An hour later, Nick surprised Matthew with a visit. "Bro, you're in town." Unexpected and pleasant, Matthew hugged Nick, patted his back. "Come on in like a farm. Tell me about it. We have such a vigilant team. Not even to steal anything, neither a cow nor a car. I'm proud of myself." "Of what?" Matthew laughed nervously, walking across the room. "But anyway, I'm glad. You're the king of battles and fields now. I'm not the only one who is the head of the native nature. I think you know." Matthew turned nervously on him. "You fulfilled the terms, made $1 million? Yes, it went on costs, payment of debts and salaries to employees. But the declaration is there." Matthew went to the locker, pulled out a bottle of whiskey and splashed some into a wide glass. For some reason, he didn't think to offer his friend a drink. That's as soon as you know what, Nick continued. I'm ready. I was supposed to get my grandfather's inheritance without this farm they slipped me. How much on your gold now? Suddenly he asked. Matthew glanced at his wristwatch. It was gold, with a fancy band with 3 chains intertwined on it. 1 minute to 12. Am I going to find out now? The doorbell rang. Matthew flinched. Nick winked at him encouragingly. You'd better open the door nicely, Matthew. On shaky legs, the young man walked to the door and opened it. On the threshold stood a group of people who immediately showed their IDs, lawyers, police. Matthew slowly made his way back into the living room and doomed himself on the soft couch in expensive gray upholstery. Nick stood up. Good afternoon. He said hello to those who entered and turned to Matthew again. Now tell me, why did you start this fraud with the will and the farm? And then you yourself prevented me from restoring it, sabotaged it, organized thefts. What did you want to accomplish? Well, there's no use in denying it. If I'd known you weren't such a fool, maybe I wouldn't have done it. Come on, brother Nick, let's get reacquainted. What kind of brother are you? Swan glared angrily. You're my real brother, my stepbrother. I've known for a long time that we had the same father. There was a time when Alexei Valerievich cheated on your mother, but then he left us. And my mom married another successful lawyer who adopted me. When I grew up, my mom told me that story. I quickly realized I was the grandson of a food tycoon. I even went to our grandfather, wanted to talk to him nicely, to become his grandson, to take care of him, to help him, so that he would recognize me officially. But he made it clear he didn't even want to know me, and he only has one legitimate grandchild to inherit, and that's you. I'm offended. Why do you get everything and I get nothing? So you forged the will? Nick asked. Yeah, I made it up. I have good connections. It wasn't hard to make fake wills with the help of some ex-lawyers. You were easy to fool the zone. But what does that have to do with the farm? I don't get it. You couldn't just make up a fake will with everything going to you. No, I couldn't. It would have looked weird. I'd have to have Vincent Kodov personally recognize me as a relative. Well, it's a long story. It's hard to explain. The farm fen was my idea, so you couldn't just inherit. I had to put you in the middle of nowhere to pick up manure, because rebuilding a farm from scratch is not a quick fix. I figured if I didn't get the inheritance, I'd make sure you didn't get it for a while longer. And I also wanted to see how you lived there without a livelihood. I sent you rations too. It's not that expensive, Matthew continued. Nick took out his cigarettes and a lighter and lit a cigarette. Many people nervously paced the living room with heavy steps. Suddenly, I found out during my visit to you that you had really started to raise the farm. Matthew continued his confession. I realized that you had learned to set goals, to persevere. I'll be honest, you surprised me, Nick. Nick sighed. Is that why you decided to fight me with sabotage, to mess up my business on the farm? I already know that the man in the hoodie who stole the cow and took the truck at night is you. You were recognized by the designer watch. Is that exclusive? Yes, Matthew glared defiantly into his half-brother's eyes. I wasn't good at a lot of things, but this one is. I had to do something to keep you away from the inheritance. I didn't think you'd figure me out. Well, you have my respect, brother. Matthew was tried. Now his life continued in prison. That was the price for not being content with what you had and trying to steal what you didn't. Nick Swan inherited everything his grandfather owned. Now, the Native Nature Network was also in his power, but that's not why he felt happy. He was drawn back to the farm. He couldn't wait to buy more equipment, cars, expand the cattle yard. But most importantly, the one who believed in him and supported him, Ellie, was waiting for him there. After a while, Nick owned several successful farms, managing them skillfully and with pleasure. He would never have believed that farming would be his true calling, and Glendale's organic products had become a favorite among the Native Nature chain's products and had become famous across the country. Ellie and Nick lay cuddled in a hammock at the upscale resort, still basking in the sun. Not a bad honeymoon, don't you think? Nick smiled and kissed the girl on the top of her blonde head. I guess it couldn't be better, Ellie said. I'll show you the whole world, not just the Maldives. Favorite wife. You know, I'm grateful to Matthew. For what? Without his machinations, I wouldn't have found my calling or known about you. And Ellie kissed Nick too and hugged him tightly. You see, Elizabeth is your daughter, all right, Sharon said in a confident tone as she examined little Holly. She had just turned 2 months old, but she seemed to have grown a couple of centimeters since her last visit. But thank goodness, the young mom exhaled with relief. Thank you, Sharon, for coming right away. As soon as I saw the rash, I started imagining all sorts of horrors. I thought of all kinds of things. And do not need unnecessary imagination, said the pediatrician after checking the arms and legs of the baby for the last time. It is better to call me right away, and then you yourself are nervous, and the child with his mood worry. She feels everything, even though she's just a baby. Right, Holly? Sharon smiled at the baby, and she bounced happily in response. "Oh, what would we do here without you?" Elizabeth said sincerely, putting her hand to her heart. "How good it is that they send such wonderful and caring specialists to us in such a remote area." Sharon said nothing. She smiled politely and began to pack her medical case. The woman turned 35 this year, but she worked and lived in a small southern village lost in the depths of Siberia. For almost 2 years now, Sharon had been assigned a small, bright house and her own office in the local hospital, the only one for many dozens of kilometers around. Despite the fact that Sharon, being a native of Moscow, was accustomed in her work and daily life to completely different conditions, the modest and somewhere even harsh life of the Siberian wilderness did not frighten her at all. The woman found in such an existence a kind of special spirituality, like that felt by monks, praying in their ascetic cells in ancient monasteries. Sharon. Wait. The pediatrician heard a familiar voice behind her. Charlotte. A kind-hearted, blonde-haired woman who worked on a local farm was hurrying toward her, carrying a large, labeled can. Charlotte, don't shout like that. You mustn't shout. You might fall, she said, looking at the woman rushing toward her. The milkmaid only waved her hand. What can I do? We're all used to it here, Charlotte said, puffing out her breath after a brisk walk. Sometimes you rush in at dawn, don't you? You think she'll be all right, especially if she's expecting a calf. Sharon, I brought you some fresh milk, said the villager, holding out a can to the pediatrician. It was a particularly good milk yield. No, Charlotte, no need, tried to refuse the doctor. But the milkmaid was very persistent. Take it, she shook her head. Do you know how much of this stuff I have at home? But you still need it more. Your work is so important. You treat our children every day until night on rounds. It's not just milk, it's nothing. Charlotte just did not spit on the ground from irritation, remembering the previous pediatrician. For you, do you know what kind of doctor she was? She basically didn't care about the kids. Only did what came to the hospital to gossip, all the gossip we'll discuss. She'd put all kinds of makeup on her face and twirl her tail in front of our paramedic. Sharon hurried to take the can and thank the woman. She sensed Charlotte was about to get back on her favorite horse, and so she did. But whatever that St. Petersburg goat does, Charlotte continued to rage, no matter how much she tortured him. Vincent wouldn't even notice her, for crying out loud. I hear you, Charlotte, but I really have to go. I've got a lot of paperwork to do at the hospital. But Charlotte was unstoppable. She couldn't rest until she'd spoken her thoughts and feelings to the end. That was her broad country nature. Vincent's a different kind of bird. He's a what's his name, isn't he? The woman thought of the right word and was silent for a moment. Aesthete. That's not the kind of girl he wants. Charlotte looked at Sharon with a cheerful slyness and finished. Like you would find my wife quiet, calm, so that in the children of her soul to put her soul. The young pediatrician was embarrassed, feeling herself blushing to the roots of her hair. Sharon, please. Charlotte continued. You should look at him, and Vincent, as soon as he lost his wife. So consider, 5 years as a widower. He doesn't fit in here. He came to us from the capital too. Sharon truly wanted to go to hell at that moment. She quickly mumbled something about not having time. She thanked him again for the milk and hurried away from the chatty Charlotte. Everyone, literally everyone in the village was wooing her to Vincent, the local paramedic. Sharon didn't argue he was a good-looking man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a gait full of dignity, and only 5 years older than her. But despite the attention Vincent was showing her, Sharon didn't reciprocate it. To her, the handsome widower paramedic was just a pleasant colleague who had no feelings for her at all. And how could it be otherwise when the young pediatrician's heart was forever occupied by another man, her own husband? Sharon hurried to push the sad thoughts away. All the more so as the modest, beige and light gray building of their rural hospital loomed ahead. As she walked up the porch steps, she thought about how lucky she was that the people here had received her so warmly and friendly. Not every stranger from the capital city could win the trust of the villagers. Sharon, however, had managed to become practically one of their own. It was largely because she was literally obsessed with her work. And now, entering her cozy little office, the woman wanted to start filling out some paperwork right away, when her attention was attracted by a huge, lush bouquet on her desk. Someone had managed to put the flowers in a vase so that a wonderful fresh fragrance spilled over the room. That's not all that flashed through Sharon's pediatrician's mind. "I've asked you so many times," she sighed. "Sharon." Knock, knock. "Can I see you?" Vincent's perfect white smile brightened as he slowly pushed his way between the door and her office. "Good afternoon," Vincent Sharon said with a strained smile. "I assume these are flowers from you? Do you like them? I thought I'd cheer you up a little. You've been looking a little sad lately. Are you all right?" Sharon put the bouquet under the table and exhaled confidently. "The bouquet is beautiful. You didn't have to go to all that expense." She turned her gaze back to the flowers. "It was enough to wish me a good day. We've been over this, Vincent. I'm very much against any kind of attention in the workplace. Outside of work, too." Vincent's smile faded a little, but the man had no intention of giving up without a fight. "You know, Sharon, sometimes I think you're teasing me on purpose," the paramedic said without changing his face. "I just don't understand why you're doing this to me. To be honest, I'm starting to run out of ideas about what else I could do to please you." Sharon looked tiredly at the persistent suitor. "Vincent, how many times do you have to do this? How can I explain to you that there can be nothing personal between us? I know it's hard for you to accept the fact that I don't want to go out with you. But let's face it, we just want different things out of life. Our personalities don't match." Sharon looked at the paramedic pleadingly. She'd lost count of the number of times she'd tried to explain such seemingly elementary things to him. "It's because you still love your husband," the man asked her painfully. Vincent knew that Sharon didn't like to talk about her past life in the capital, and yet he never missed an opportunity to remind her of her reasons for moving to Yelchihu. Sharon's face instantly became impenetrable. "I'm sorry, Vincent, but I'm really busy right now. I'm afraid we have nothing more to talk about." "I understand your feelings as well as anyone," Sharon, Vincent said in a serious tone. "Believe me, I've been where you are. But sooner or later, you're going to have to get back to real life. Sometimes we have to accept the fact that our nearest and dearest are gone. By letting go of the situation, you can finally look around you and see that there are people around who care about you. I'll be waiting for you. Sharon, I hope you soon realize that you and I have a good chance of making a wonderful family." Sharon looked at the paramedic. Her lips were trembling and her eyes were full of tears. "Vincent, please." The woman cried out, pale, unable to contain her emotions, and then she burst into a womanly sob, dropping her head into her hands. "Cry, Sharon, cry," Vincent said softly as he left her office. "Maybe tears will sober you up. How many times do you have to act like a lady of steel?" The woman didn't answer him. She just couldn't talk right now. So the paramedic had to leave her, leaving Sharon with the solitude she wanted. Sharon's mood was completely and utterly ruined. The pediatrician spent the rest of the day filling out the medical records of her young patients and their mothers, as well as seeing the babies in the hospital. The young woman tried to behave as usual, friendly and polite. However, there were cats on her soul. A familiar dull ache, coupled with intense anxiety, had begun to gradually fill her heart ever since Vincent had made her think of her husband again. "Ryan," she said to him mentally every time she felt unbearably tormented, "I believe we'll meet again. Let others say whatever they want. Remind me that you're probably not alive anymore. I don't believe it. I don't believe it, and I never will. You're so strong, so brave. You couldn't just die then, you couldn't." In the evening, getting ready for bed, Sharon sat for a long time in front of the mirror, looking at her face, which had stopped from heavy thoughts and worries. Who would have thought that in just 3 years the once young, energetic Sharon would suddenly turn into a grief-stricken woman whose gray hair, openly competing with the silver threads in her once perfect dark blonde hair, made her look much older and more serious than she really was. The young pediatrician used to love to read before bed, not professionally, but the most popular fiction she could get her hands on. Favor, in those days, living in the capital, the girl did not lack books. Here the maximum that she could afford was the magazine Bulletin of Medicine, and that by subscription, which she had so thoughtfully registered at the post office on the very day she moved to the village. No online store had ever delivered books to such a remote region. Yes, to be honest, Sharon was no longer drawn to the twisted detective stories or the magical adventures in a love story that she had once loved so much. The world had long ago lost all color for her, and only her work had kept the woman afloat. Immersing herself in the problems of newborns and their young, and sometimes not so young mothers, Sharon thus quenched her own pain, which every time stung her in the very center of her soul. It was worth it for the woman to remember that she herself was incapable of having children. Sharon stood up from the table where the small mirror stood, and out of the corner of her eye she noticed how thin and unattractive her figure had become. The expression that love dries a lonely woman dry described her at that difficult time in her life. She was lonely, and she loved with all her heart and soul, wholeheartedly and boundlessly one and only one person, who most likely was no longer alive. But pediatrician Sharon Kuznetsova couldn't even bear the thought of, as Vincent put it, resigning herself to letting go. Despite all the blackest moments of her reflection, there was still a faint hope in the same heart where the unrelenting pain now lingered. The hope that lifted Sharon in the morning every day and made her believe that one day she would hear the familiar warm voice of her adored husband. That night the woman could not sleep a wink. She kept returning her thoughts to her past, to those wonderful and easy years when she and her husband were truly happy, and nothing had marred their quiet family joy. They had made great plans for the future, and were completely unaware that all their hard-won happiness could collapse in an instant. Sharon felt tears running down her cheeks again. "Oh my God," the woman whispered to herself. "Ryan, honey, I'm sorry I'm such a sentimental fool." Before the inner gaze of poor Kuznetsova again involuntarily flashed colorful pictures of the years lived with her husband, gradually plunging the woman into a strong, but so simultaneously beautiful and sad dream, which the healer of children's diseases would prefer not to see at all, so as not to be even more emotional after her imminent awakening. Sharon had once had a very different life. Bright lights of the capital, work in one of the best clinics of the city, weekend meetings with her friends and shopping trips to fashionable boutiques. All this was an integral part of the young pediatrician's daily routine. Sharon was born into a good and respected family of doctors. Her mother worked in gynecology all her life, while her father was one of the leading surgeons in Seattle itself. The girl always saw the example of her parents in front of her eyes. Strong, purposeful, they went straight to their goal and achieved everything themselves, thanks to their own diligence and natural talents, as well as the desire to constantly learn and develop in their chosen field. But besides all this, they also loved each other without memory, despite the fact that they lived together for almost 25 years. Their daughter dreamed of continuing the noble dynasty of doctors, choosing for herself the direction of pediatrics. Thus, Sharon was able to combine in one profession at once two of her passions, medicine and work with children. The girl studied easily and with pleasure, and easily graduated from medical school with honors, after which almost immediately got a job in one of the best consultations in the city. From there, she slowly moved to an excellent private clinic, where she worked for the next few years, gradually improving her professional qualifications. She met Ryan as a mature and self-sufficient young woman. She was 26 years old at the time. The young employee of the rescue service conquered Sharon by his strength, virility, but at the same time softness and kindness. Sharon had never met a man as understanding as Ryan. At that time, she had already had several unsuccessful romances, and she was disappointed in the opposite sex, intending to devote herself fully to work alone. That year, she and a couple of other specialists from the clinic were sent under a general quota for training in the so-called survival course. And that's where the girl first saw her future husband. The muscular blonde instructor immediately made her heart beat faster. His neat 3-day stubble looked so natural, but at the same time stylish, that Sharon involuntarily thought to herself, is he not watching her in some special way to keep her in such an attractive condition for all women? Being naturally shy and modest, Sharon didn't know for sure if this amazing young man would pay attention to her. So she simply continued her studies, trying to focus on the main thing she'd been sent here for. "Did you like our handsome instructor too?" Sharon Tora, her roommate in the student employee dormitory and part-time young gynecologist, prodded her. Now that's the kind of guy who's got some dignity. I've seen the way he carries himself. Like he knows he's got manners superior to any of us. We'll be on the hook in no time. You got it, Tora. Sharon shrugged it off. She felt the color flood her normally so calm and clear face. What are you talking nonsense again? He's handsome, of course, but nothing more than that, she said. You were staring at him when he was giving CPR to that mannequin. She made a joke about her, that's all. I imagined him doing the same to you. Tora rolled her eyes dreamily. Sharon just pressed her lips tighter together, looking down at her adorable nose. Fuck, Tora. You look like a grown-up girl, but you're acting like a teenager, honestly. It's disgusting. What's disgusting? You think if you act like a saint, he'll pay attention to you right away. Tora easily straightened her curly hair with her fingers. You have to be brave, Sylvia. Now, men have long ago not modesty in women appreciate, and what is scientifically called initiative. Let others take the initiative. I'm a fan of more classic courtship, Sharon said calmly. If we're to meet, he'll be the first to announce his intention. And I, as a decent girl, will see if I should build a relationship with him, or if he's just a frivolous man, in a word. Tora shook her head reproachfully. That's why Peter and Nick both ran away from you with their heels glistening. You're too picky. Do you think long and hard before you make the first move? Look, Sylvia, there's a lot of pretty girls here besides you and me. They might be ahead of you. I don't want him. Tora, calm down. Sharon had no stomach for it, but then she felt her heart racing, as if she were already jealous of Ryan's jealousy of some ephemeral other hottie her roommate had just told her about. All right, I'll shut up, Tora smiled, turning in her bed to her other side and adding, tomorrow we have our final class. There it is, your chance, take it. Or are you going to miss out on your happiness again? Sharon didn't say anything. She just turned her back to the wall. Her face burned like she'd been rubbed with red pepper. Her heart was galloping in her chest, so that she thought Tora would hear that strange sound in the silence of the night room. It was the first time since their last breakup, or perhaps in her entire life, that Sharon had felt such strong emotions toward a complete stranger. What nonsense, the girl said to herself. Brian's? You haven't exchanged a word with him in 2 weeks, and already you're asking him to marry you? You fool, go to sleep. Tora's right. Tomorrow's the big day, the last class, which she needs to pass with flying colors. And she came here for a reason? With such exciting thoughts, the girl fell asleep that night. Strange as it may seem, the next day went quite smoothly. Sharon passed the exam with a solid A and was preparing to go with the other girls to the creative evening, organized for them by the base staff. At the moment when the girl was scrutinizing herself in the mirror, trying to make sure that the dress she had chosen was not too short for such an event, a quiet knock sounded at the door of her room. Come in, who's there? The girl shouted into the hallway, while adjusting the massive round earrings of silver and enamel in her ears. Someone silently came inside and stopped behind Sharon's back. The girl flinched when she saw a familiar, but unexpected reflection in the mirror. Is that you? God, you scared me, Sharon exclaimed, turning around. In front of her stood the same instructor, Ryan Smith, whom she had been thinking about so often the last few days. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that at all, the boy said, and lowered his stunning blue eyes in embarrassment. In his hand was clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, which he, shyly, slowly extended to the girl. Here, this is for you. I'm sorry, I didn't know what kind of flowers you prefer, but we have amazing nature here. So I thought maybe the local flora would make you happy. Sharon looked up at him, her dark gray eyes wide with amazement. Ryan's face gradually flushed with a delicate blush, just as it must have done on her skin now. It's my pleasure, she said, taking the bouquet from him. They are really beautiful flowers, better than any roses. A shy hopefulness flashed in Ryan's eyes. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind going to the dance with me. We're having some sort of disco at the end of the night. It's funny, of course, grown men dancing to popular tunes. But still, I've been looking at you since last week. He was embarrassed. I apologize for being so frank, but Sharon, I like you very much, so I'd like you to do me the honor of spending this evening with me as my companion. Sharon's excitement made her speechless for the first minute. To think of it, the harsh-looking lifeguard turned out to be such a gentle and vulnerable person. One could never guess what was behind the facade of a male brutality and outward calmness. Ryan, it turned out, had been feeling the same way she had. "Of course I'll say the honor," she replied jokingly and smiled sweetly at her chosen one. "Just promise me that you won't smoke too much. You know, there is nothing worse than a partner who smokes before the dance. I just can't stand cigarette smoke very well." Ryan's face lit up with a bright and pleasant smile. "That's a wish I can easily fulfill by pretending to be a fairy genie," the young man said. He folded his hands in the typical genie gesture and bowed slightly to Sharon. Sharon didn't know where to put her embarrassment. "God forgive me for this indiscretion," she exclaimed. "I should have known that many of your employees are in favor of a healthy lifestyle. It's just that both of my previous admirers were not averse to the occasional cigarette. And it was a pain in the ass for me." Sharon looked into Ryan's blue eyes and bit her tongue. Who was she to bring up past men? But today the lifeguard took her words to heart. He didn't seem at all embarrassed by the mention of the girl's past romances. Ryan, giving her his elbow like a real gentleman, took her straight to the local house of culture, where the lifeguards had already prepared a wonderful concert for all the students with jokes, poems, and even songs of their own composition. Sharon liked the latter very much and made a great impression on her. That evening the girl listened to a real bard's song for the first time. "Thank you for this wonderful evening," she thanked her companion when the dance was over and they slowly walked under the blossoming apple trees to the girls' dormitory. "It's been a long time since I've felt so, I don't know, so free. I guess it was so easy to get away from the daily routine and the ubiquitous hustle and bustle." "Yeah," Ryan said, agreeing with her. "I've always felt that this place has a special energy. It's like nothing special, just an ordinary base in the suburbs. But once you get a few kilometers away from the city, it's like a whole different world. No high rises, no shopping centers. At every step there is only a quiet, measured life, where everyone can find his real place." Sharon looked at Ryan and couldn't believe her happiness. Here he was, the man who understood her inner state more than anyone. No matter how much she loved the city with its frenzied pace of life, bright, sometimes shouting windows, ubiquitous cafes and stores, but only here, many kilometers away from the metropolis, she truly felt what life was. It was as if all her senses were heightened in an instant, giving her some secret, but at the same time so simple knowledge. Every person has a true purpose. It is only necessary to follow it at the call of your heart, and then harmony and grace will come into your life. Sharon suddenly looked at him seriously. "Ryan," she said, "can I see you again? I don't mean to be impertinent, but I just think that something good could happen between us." "Sure," Ryan assured her calmly. "Let's exchange phone numbers. I'll text you as soon as I get into town." Ryan smiled so joyfully and childishly that Sharon's heart was immediately warmed by the warmth of the light feeling that was budding in her soul. Back in the metropolis, Sharon thought a lot about what this amazing trip had given her. Should she write to Ryan herself? Or was it better to wait until he was free to make the first move? The girl's doubts were dispelled when a few days later she received the following message on her phone: "I'll be in town the other day. Do you want to meet in the park?" Without thinking for a second and trembling with joy, Sharon immediately replied, "Yes, I'll be looking forward to seeing you." The girl received a playful smiley face in response, and then exhaled with relief. It seems that a new stage in her life was beginning. The first date was followed by several more, and soon the relationship between the young people became really serious. Ryan and Sharon couldn't seem to spend a day apart. They were constantly on the phone, calling each other and sending each other cute postcards. Just like young college students just getting their first taste of true love. Less than 6 months later, Ryan proposed to Sharon. The girl naturally agreed, promising the young lifeguard that she would make him the happiest man in the world. "I'm the one who should promise you such things." Baby Ryan kissed his bride and said, pleasantly surprised, "Remember, a man's duty is to take care of his woman and give her only love and joy, but also to protect her." "You'll never regret being my wife," Ryan said to Sharon. Sharon's parents approved of their daughter's choice. Ryan instilled confidence in them and said the normal, right things. And after talking to Dustin, the girl's father, he became like family to them. I grew up in an orphanage, Ryan told them honestly, but I know what a real family should be like. Sharon had told me a lot about your relationship with Brenda. If I can come even an inch closer to something like that in my marriage to your daughter, I'd be happy. It's good that you intend to make my daughter happy, Dustin told him. But what about the fact that your job is dangerous? You might leave me alone. What then? That question didn't bother Ryan at all. We have all the security measures in place at the base. Yeah, there's a monthly diagnostic on vehicles and equipment. And in case of any damage, parts or technically important parts of the equipment are replaced immediately. Ryan spoke to the bride's father as if he were reporting on the condition of the facility to his superiors clearly and precisely, so that the man had no doubts. His job, though it entailed a risk to life, they had everything they needed to avoid that risk. As for Brenda, she accepted her future son-in-law as if he were her own son. The woman was worried that Ryan, being from an orphanage, had not received enough maternal warmth in his childhood, and therefore at every opportunity she tried to feed the young man with homemade pastries or hot soup. "Try this bread," Sharon's mother said, setting a plate of her specialty soup in front of Ryan. "I made it especially for you. I had a feeling you and my daughter would drop by today." Ryan was embarrassed to refuse, even though Sharon's mom's soup seemed a little heavy for him. As he thanked Brenda for the treat, he chuckled at Sharon, who also understood, but couldn't stop her mother's kindness. "I don't suppose you've ever had soup like this before." Brenda continued to fuss over Ryan. "Sharon can make it too. Don't forget to remind me more often. She's been doing nothing but eating on the run lately with her job." "She can't do that now. She's getting married, after all. And now it is already normal for him to feed and eat well, so that the baby you have soon." Sharon blushed like a boiled lobster. Come on. What baby? What baby? We're not married yet. We're not even getting married for another month. Ryan and I wanted to live a little for ourselves before we thought about kids." There was an awkward silence. Ryan looked expressively at his fiancée and then at his parents' disappointed faces. "A little bit." "How long is this going to take?" Brenda asked with sadness in her voice. "I hope you won't be one of those modern couples who think it's better to have 3 cats, a dog, and a parrot than to have a couple of big kids. You're not one of those, are you?" "What? No, of course not," Sharon exclaimed immediately. "I can't believe you would think such a thing. Ryan and I are perfectly normal people, and we're going to have kids. Just not so soon. I want to work a little longer, to finally realize I'm a professional first." "Honey, there's nothing stopping you from pursuing your interests in pediatrics and being a mom at the same time," Dustin said reasonably. "We're not old anymore, and we'd like to nurse our grandchildren while we still have the energy." All Sharon wants to say is Ryan suddenly joined the conversation, that she and I have decided to wait a year or two until we decide we're ready for a baby. "No one's talking about taking away the joy of having grandchildren," Dustin, his future son-in-law, reassured him. "Well, if that's the time frame we're talking about, that's fine." Dustin chewed his lip. "All right. You can live for yourself for now. Just don't take too long. Sharon's at the right age. There's no telling what kind of pregnancy complications might arise if she wanted to have a baby after 30. Sharon clutched the spoon as hard as she could. As much as she loved her parents, such concern about her condition and the possibility of giving birth made her slightly panicky. The girl had always known she wanted to be a mother, but she wanted to decide for herself at what age and exactly how that would happen. Her father and mother kept pushing her, scaring her that her childbearing age had already crossed, in their opinion, all reasonable boundaries. Sharon still had fresh memories of how upset Brenda had been when she had broken up with her last boyfriend. Or rather, the real reason for her upset had not been her daughter's personal tragedy, but the fact that she hadn't thought to get pregnant by her boyfriend so that she could, as her mother had put it at the time, have a baby for herself and thereby bring closure to their family. Sharon felt Ryan squeeze her other hand under the table. His gaze seemed to say to her, "Calm down, this doesn't change anything. We're still going to do things the way we want to do them." Sharon smiled at her fiancé and thought again about how lucky she was to have met a man who truly understood her. Sharon's wedding was modest. On the groom's side were only a few of his best friends from the squad. On the bride's side were friends, relatives, and a couple of her father's good friends who had been specially invited from the Department of Health. Sharon and Ryan had decided on purpose not to have a lavish celebration. They were going to use some of the money they had saved for the down payment on the mortgage. Young people dreamed of their own apartment, as Sharon all this time lived with her parents, and Ryan and it all on a rented apartment. However, Brenda and Dustin gave the couple a royal gift for the wedding. "Here," Dustin said to Ryan, handing him the keys to their new apartment. "It's a 2-bedroom in the center of town, close to the subway. 10 minutes and Sharon can easily get to the clinic without traffic, and you'll be able to take a shortcut to your job too." Ryan didn't know how to thank his father-in-law, so he just hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dustin," the groom said sincerely. "If you only knew how grateful we are." "Don't mention it," said the bride's father. "I do it first of all for my daughter, to make her life more comfortable. You take care of her and do not forget about the grandchildren. My mother and I will be waiting for them very much," the elderly surgeon reminded his son-in-law, and then jokingly wagged his finger at Ryan. When she learned that she and her husband would now have their own apartment, Sharon squealed with delight and threw herself on her father's neck. "Daddy, my love," she said, kissing her father on the cheeks. "You are the best. My darling. How did you and Mom manage it?" Dustin said, infected with joy for his daughter. "I knew you'd be getting married soon. So my mom and I decided to prepare a family nest for you in advance. We're not animals. We know how hard it is for young people to get their own place these days." Sharon and Ryan felt the happiest they'd ever felt. They bravely looked forward to the future and believed that a long and wonderful family life was ahead of them. The first 2 years flew by like a blink of an eye for the young family. Sharon worked at the clinic all the time, and in the evening she turned into a desperate housewife, always cooking something delicious and unusual to please her husband, returning late at night from his dangerous service. Ryan, on the other hand, was constantly on the road. He had been in all kinds of extreme situations. Sharon, of course, worried about her husband with all her heart. And every time she waited with bated breath for a call from him. But God willing, everything was fine, despite the fact that Ryan had to pull people out from under the rubble, and for zealous fishermen chase away from the pond that was half standing, and much more. And then a joyous event happened in their family. One evening, when Ryan returned from work, Sharon met him with eyes burning with happiness and slyly glittering. "What is it, honey? What's wrong?" asked his beloved wife. "I have a surprise for you," Sharon told him confidentially and pulled him into the living room. There on the exquisitely set table, Ryan was waiting for a festive dinner, which he had not received from his wife for a long time. In the center, a large French baked chicken and wine awaited him on a huge porcelain platter. Nearby in pots lay boiled sweet potatoes and corn and fresh seafood, which Sharon had thoughtfully laid out on a separate platter. On the other side of the table, appetizing fruit was in a tall vase, and a bottle of excellent wine stood next to it. And for some reason, a carton of orange juice. "Wow," Ryan marveled sincerely. "We're having such a party for some reason." The man kissed his wife and looked at her questioningly. "Did you get a promotion?" "Well," Sharon said evasively, "you could say that. Just not as much of a promotion as you'd think." "Yes," said the husband, intrigued. Then his wife sent him off to wash his hands while she laid out clean napkins. She really wanted to make this evening memorable for them for a long time, and for that everything had to look just perfect. "But what's the surprise?" Ryan asked a little later, when she sat him down at the table and put the steaming chicken on his plate. "I'm all excited to find out." Ryan jokingly jingled his fork and knife, showing that he was both very hungry and waiting for his wife's response. "I'll tell you everything now, just for starters." "Open the juice and wine, please. I can have juice." Ryan didn't understand his wife's hint at first and started calmly unscrewing the cork from the bottle of wine. "Wait, why do you want juice?" When it suddenly dawned on him. Sharon tried unsuccessfully to suppress a smile, but she could feel herself starting to blush again. She covered her lips with her hand and looked at her husband eloquently. "You mean you're pregnant?" Ryan asked quietly. Sharon lowered her eyes, then nodded affirmatively. God, baby, we're having a little one. Oh, honey, sweetheart, I'm so happy, he exclaimed. And I'm going to be a father, a father. Ryan almost dropped the bottle, trying to jump up from the table and hug his wife. When he succeeded, he twirled Sharon in a joyful waltz. The young woman laughed and never took her eyes off her beloved husband for a moment. How many things do we have to do with you now? Hastily said, excited by the happiness of parenthood man. We need to decide where the nursery will be, the crib to choose. Have you told your parents yet? Not yet, with a laugh, shaking her lush hair, his wife answered him. We'll tell them together when we go to Mom and Dad's next weekend. Ryan nodded understandingly. God, Sharon, I thought, this is happiness. A loving wife and a hot dinner every day, a loyal support system. But this is something else entirely. I love you so much, my darling. I love you so much. Or Ryan and Sharon. An exciting but beautiful day began. Everything seemed to be the same as before, but now every evening they were together doing things inherent in all future parents. Together they chose a stroller for the baby. They dreamed how they would paint the wall to which they would put the baby's cradle. They argued about whether it would be a boy or a girl, and what name they would give their future baby. One day, when Sharon was already 3 months pregnant, she and Ryan decided to spend a cultural weekend, and therefore went to the theater. There was a new production of the opera The Flying Dutchman, and Sharon really wanted to see it. The play struck a young woman with its scenery and the powerful play of actors. The evening promised to be unforgettable, because after the theater, Ryan offered to go to a restaurant. But after such a 3-hour spectacle, you and I should definitely have something special to eat, Ryan said cheerfully to his wife as they left the theater. You must be awfully tired. I'd be a terrible husband if I made you cook something at home after all this. No, let's go eat somewhere nice. If you do that, you'll be the perfect husband, Sharon agreed. Honestly, I'm ready to eat an elephant right now, or at least a hippopotamus. Those tiny sandwiches in the theater cafeteria didn't impress me at all. Dinner went great. Sharon was getting ready to remember it as one of the most beautiful nights of their lives when the unthinkable happened. The couple was on their way out to the parking lot. Ryan had hailed a cab, and it should have been here any minute, when 3 strange men blocked their way. Judging by the dilated pupils and peculiar odor, these types were clearly under the influence of alcohol or some kind of substance. All 3 had tattooed arms. Guys, look at the lovebirds, one of them shouted to the others, and the group instantly began to study Ryan and Sharon. Ryan realized at once what was going on. He threw up his hands in a peaceful manner. Hey guys, don't worry. Let's break this up amicably. We don't need any trouble. He pulled his wallet out of his jacket pocket and took out all the cash he had. Everything he had. Guys, really take it, go with God. My wife and I just want to go home. That's all Ryan said as calmly as possible. But Sharon, frozen in terror, could feel how tense her husband was. The tallest of the 3, obviously the leader of the gang, glanced at the small sum Ryan was offering him. Then he took a couple of steps toward Ryan and snatched the money from his hands in one swift movement. Like a monkey finding a new toy at the bottom of its cage, the bandit jumped up and down in front of his henchmen. Look, he waved the bills in front of their faces. The people are understanding nowadays. I'm glad I like it. It's boring, one of them said in a nasty voice, and then he stared at Sharon. No fights, no chicks for once. The bald, stout man took a slow step toward Ryan's wife. I think this one's pretty good, the bastard said. Juicy sweet. Don't you want to have some fun with some normal guys? Ryan was instantly eager to fight. Sharon felt her mouth go dry. A second later, a nasty, sour lump rose from somewhere in her throat, making the woman instinctively clutch at her stomach, where the life of her small child lay. Fear. A nasty animal fear for the life of her husband and their unborn son or daughter was what Sharon felt at that moment. She pressed herself against her spouse's back, closing her eyes for a second. Don't go near her, asshole, Ryan threw in his face and immediately assumed a fighting stance. One move and you could kiss your worthless life goodbye. Wow, this praised piece of shit can also talk, the third bandit, who was very muscular, answered instead of his comrade. Science. Try saying that again. With these words, the bastard pulled out a shining folding blade, suspiciously resembling a razor. "Not so brave, eh?" said the fat man enigmatically, pointing to his friend's arm. "Now, my friends and I will quickly clean up your face, so that you know how to talk to respectable people. Will your new clothes come with us? Don't worry, it's not far to the nearest bushes." All three of them laughed like old hyenas. Ryan was like a rock, ready to make a death-defying leap. "When I say run, just run. Don't look back," Ryan whispered over his shoulder to his wife. No, I'm staying here with you," Sharon slipped into his jacket pitifully. "Come on, honey, come on out to the big guys. Come on, honey. Come out to the big uncles," the fat thug said. "They want to play with you so badly that your husband can hardly get away with it," he laughed. All three of them lunged at her husband. "Ryan," Tora shouted, and Ryan was immediately engaged in a pitched battle with the three ghouls. He began to strike them with his legs and arms, trying to drive the bandits away from him. The man couldn't make a single grab because he risked slowing down too much, which would be a fatal loss for him. Sharon darted to the right, hoping to outrun the razor-wielding thug, but he was nimble and immediately delivered a powerful blow to the woman's stomach. "Where are you going, Otter?" The thug whispered and grabbed Sharon by the hair, pulling her against him. The woman felt first the stench of his breath, then the cold blade against her tender neck. "Ryan," she screamed, and Ryan immediately lost his guard, taking a crushing blow to the jaw and falling to his knees. "No," Sharon shouted in desperation and kicked him in the groin with all her might. Despite the pain in her stomach, she couldn't let the criminals kill her husband. "She's going to fucking kill him in front of her," the lanky guy shouted, and he and the fat guy started kicking Ryan in the stomach and head area. Sharon managed to escape from the fat man's death throes for a second, but he managed to slash her across the chest with a razor. Lowering her head, the girl saw a scarlet rivulet pouring down her light-colored dress. "Come here, you bitch," the villain growled, and with a short thrust, he jammed the weapon right into Sharon's stomach. In an instant, the world around her became one big blurry blur. The pain was so unbearable that Sharon forgot how to breathe as she whispered her husband's name one last time. She collapsed and fell into darkness. Sharon was consciously aware of the squealing of police sirens. Apparently, the restaurant staff had heard the noise in the backyard and called the police. An ambulance came with them, but Sharon didn't see that. She was surrounded on all sides by a clammy, cold darkness. Sharon, can you hear me, sweetheart? Is it me, your husband Ryan?" It was with great difficulty that Sharon opened her eyes. Above her was a perfectly white ceiling that at first even blinded the woman with its light. Next to her, she heard a nasty beeping sound. It was her condition being recorded by special medical devices. Sharon felt a long plastic tube inserted into her nose and cool air flowing through it. Then the woman felt someone gently and tenderly squeezing her hand. "Ryan," she said very weakly. "Is it really you? Are you alive?" Leaning over her, her husband's face confirmed it. "I'm a tough nut to crack, thank God. You scared me a lot, sweetheart. I thought I'd lost you." It took Sharon exactly half a second to recall the events leading up to her hospital stay. "Baby," the young woman exclaimed in a pale voice and immediately pressed her hand to her belly. It was completely flat and tightly bandaged. "Our baby. Ryan. What's wrong with him?" I asked my wife, anticipating the worst. Instead of answering, the man lowered his eyes and then ruffled his hair in a nervous motion. "The doctors fought for your life for so long. They had no choice. There was no saving our baby anyway. I'm so sorry, honey, I'm so sorry." No way. It can't be." Sharon was hysterical. The attending physician came running into the room. "What have you done?" The elderly surgeon glared angrily at Ryan while trying to hold the convulsing woman. "Who gave you permission to tell your patient such news when she was on the verge of death? Leave this room immediately. Nurse, hurry up and get me a sedative." The doctor turned to the nurse, who ran to the nurse at the same moment. "It would have been better to say it right away," Ryan said grimly, struggling to rise from his chair. It would have hurt more later. The surgeon looked at him for a moment, then shook his head sternly. I understand you're both in shock, but that didn't give you the right to risk your wife's health like that. Ryan seemed to ignore what the surgeon had said. He looked at the unfolding picture with a sense of utter hopelessness. His beloved had almost died and lost a child, and he, an emergency worker, couldn't prevent it. Sharon, I'll come back tomorrow, his husband said with tears in his eyes, and left the room. The hardest part for Sharon was just ahead. After a long and painful recovery, the doctor announced a disappointing verdict. Because of her injuries, she would never be able to have children again. The young woman was absolutely devastated. After arriving home, Sharon could not remember what had happened in those moments around her. All the days merged into one hopelessly gray streak. Ryan tried to somehow reach out to his wife, to bring her out of this comatose state. But it was no use. The parents, as depressed by their daughter's condition as her husband, also tried to talk to Sharon, but she was completely unresponsive. No one but Ryan and her family knew how hard it was for Sharon to get up in the morning every day to get back to at least a semblance of her old self. It wasn't until almost a year later that she was able to consciously perceive her surroundings again. The pain of losing the baby was still too fresh to completely forget the experience. The woman's stomach was now forever imprinted with the marks of that horrific evening. Sharon hid the scars under dark, tight clothing. She could no longer wear a swimsuit or a light summer dress. She kept feeling like strangers would stare at her gruesome cuts. Even with Ryan, she now acted cold and reserved. And by no means did that mean she blamed him for what had happened. But she knew the anguish he must have felt, and she no longer thought their love was appropriate. At least not until the whole story had finally dissolved into the daily routine of life as it went on. To recover and distract herself from the inevitable longing, Sharon went back to work, even though it was unbearably painful to look at other people's children every day. More and more often she found herself thinking that little by little, a little at a time, she was getting better. The pain was slowly receding to the very bottom of her soul, leaving only a calmness bordering on indifference. That had been Sharon's salvation to begin with. And then when she found herself in a state where she had just found stable ground beneath her feet, her whole world fell apart again into tiny pieces from which she could no longer reassemble anything. It had been exactly 3 years ago, the year before Sharon had finally moved to Yale Chio. Ryan had gone on a business trip somewhere up north, to Siberia. There were terrible fires there that year, and Sharon's husband was called together with other emergency workers to extinguish the fire on helicopters by dropping a special extinguishing compound. The worst thing, in what all the time after that Sharon blamed herself, is that she felt exactly nothing. Calmly let her beloved husband, the only person she had ever known, go on that damned business trip. 2 days after Ryan left, she got a call from an unknown number. "Hello," Sharon Clark said, an unfamiliar male voice. "Yes, it's me. Who am I speaking to?" "This is Captain Leo Stone of the emergency response team. Your husband, Ryan Clark." Sharon's heart immediately dropped into her stomach. It made it hard to think, not just to speak. "Yes," the woman said softly. "Sharon, be strong. Your husband died heroically while fighting a fire in the woods." Sharon felt the floor beneath her begin to move slowly away from her. Grasping the edge of the table to keep from falling, The pediatrician interjected. "So how is it dead?" "No, there must be some mistake. He's only been gone 2 days." "I'm sorry," the captain said a little more gently. "Your husband's helicopter got into a difficult situation. One of its blades failed, and then the whole apparatus fell into the river. We found the body of one of the pilots at once, but your husband must have been carried down the river by the current. Our divers are already checking the area." Something inside Sharon twitched weakly. Maybe it was the last strings of her nerves. "Wait, are you saying that Ryan's body hasn't been found yet? Wait, but that could mean he had a chance. Maybe he's still alive. Maybe he's washed ashore somewhere and needs help." There was a sad sigh from the phone. "If only it were that easy," Sharon Leo answered her. "There was a lot of height from which they fell. Plus the damage to the helicopter is such that, in general, if I were you, I would not have any illusions. but our team is doing everything necessary to comb the area as efficiently as possible." Sharon answered the captain coldly and firmly. "Luckily, Captain, you're not in my shoes and you're not likely to ever be. I'll be on the first flight as soon as possible. I want to be personally involved in the search for my husband." "I suppose so, Sharon, but you don't need all this. I promise you," Leo warned her paternally. But the lifeguard's wife was a stubborn person when it came to keeping her family together. "Let me decide for myself what I do and what I don't want to do. Captain, give me the address, I'll be there." Having warned her parents and superiors, the woman went into the heart of the taiga with members of the search and rescue team. Sharon searched the forests, but there was no sign of Ryan. "I told you you'd only be wasting your breath with this," Captain Stone lamented Sharon's arrival. "We haven't accomplished anything anyway," Sharon told the captain. "No," Sharon told him firmly. "My husband will be considered missing until you find his body. Only then will I accept that he's dead. Until then, you must keep searching as long as you can." An exhausted Sharon returned to New York. The search for her husband continued for several more months, but all was in vain. Finally, the woman came to a difficult decision to abandon everything in the capital and move permanently to a remote taiga village. That's exactly what Jilburi turned out to be. "Daughter, think about it," Brenda begged her, depressed by the situation. "I understand your grief over losing Ryan. He'll always be in your heart. But you don't just want to leave your job and your home. You want to leave us?" Sharon's elderly mother was struggling to hold back tears. "Mom, I'm sorry, but this is the only thing I really need right now," the pediatrician explained to her. "I can't stay here anymore. It reminds me of how much he and I had, how much we had in common and how much we lost." Brenda looked at her daughter with an attentive, understanding gaze. "Promise to write to me," at least her mother asked with a pleading tone in her voice. "Of course I will, Mommy," she said, hugging the older woman and assuring her daughter. "I'll write as soon as I get settled in. I'll write right away. I have already agreed with the local hospital. They take me immediately on specialty. Can you imagine? The staff there is very small. Only 10 people. So you don't have to worry about rumors about me." "Oh, honey. Rumors are so infectious," Brenda said, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief. "If you don't want to, they'll come out of thin air. You're new to them, so they won't trust you at first. They'll look at you. You just have to be patient, see if you can fit into their way of life. Just write to me, sweetheart, and don't forget your mother and father." Sharon hugged her mother fondly and promised her that she would be all right. The next morning she was already sitting in the airplane carrying her to the distant, uncharted Siberian lands. Sharon had made 3 transfers to Jilburi, 2 of which were by small private helicopter and 1 by an old, half-decayed bus. One thing Sharon kept carefully hidden, even from herself. She hoped to move to the remote taiga and become at least a small microscopic part closer to her missing husband. When Sharon woke up the next morning, after a heavy night of dreams mixed with memories, her head ached so badly that she didn't know where to put herself. After taking 2 painkillers, Sharon made her way to her medical station, hoping that the fresh air and the sense of forest herbs would cheer her up a bit. As soon as she was deep into her paperwork, however, Charlotte Karen, the milkmaid, burst into her office. "Sharon, you've got all the hope in the world," Charlotte said, out of breath. "Charlotte, what's wrong? Calm down, take a breath. Would you like some water?" "I don't have time for this," the blonde waved her hand at her, panting. "Are we going?" Sharon didn't understand. "Kyla, our witch doctor Michelle's granddaughter, is not doing well. I was at their house in the woods the other day." Charlotte circled the space around her uncertainly. "So Kayla was already withering away before my eyes. And this morning her grandmother Michelle told her to call her doctor. Well, my potions aren't working." Sharon had heard something about Michelle, the village witch doctor, an old woman who was rumored to be over 100 years old. She rarely showed up in the village, preferring to buy food and things through the locals. Sharon didn't approve of the women going to the witch doctor, but there was nothing she could do about it. They had been accustomed to consulting the witch since they were little girls. The only thing Sharon hoped was that they would be smart enough not to entrust their lives and the lives of their young children to the witch doctor's potions. Not too long ago, though, there was a rumor in the village that Michelle had a granddaughter. However, no matter how many times Sharon herself tried to get to her to check on the baby, she could not find the old witch's hut in the woods. And Michelle's daughter Pamela flatly refused to see a doctor. She and her grandmother, in principle, as Sharon realized, were against modern technology and medicine. But they brought the child down with their herbs. Sharon exclaimed excitedly and immediately got ready to leave. "Kayla, how old is she?" "She looks like she's just a baby." "About a year old, maybe two," Charlotte said after a moment's thought. "She's a baby," Sharon said, shaking her head. "Charlotte, can you take me that way or to their house? I keep getting lost whenever I go there." Charlotte looked at the pediatrician strangely, then muttered quietly, "It's strange, children shouldn't go there." She added louder, "Unless Michelle herself didn't give you a pass." "Okay, but follow me. Follow the trail. The terrain there is swampy. It's easy to stumble," the milkmaid replied. In half an hour, the two women were already walking in the impenetrable forest. Charlotte walked lightly and briskly, almost flying over the roots and sharp branches that seemed to avoid the villager. For Sharon, however, the journey had become a living hell. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, where the witch's neat hut stood, Sharon felt like a squeezed lemon and scratched from the trees and shrubs. "Here we are," Charlotte said, pointing to the witch doctor's house. "If you will excuse me, I will go home. I have 1,000 chores to do." "Of course you do," Sharon nodded. "Thank you for your help. It's amazing how I couldn't find their house all this time. It didn't seem that far away, but every time I did, it was like I'd lost my way." Charlotte eyed Sharon a little suspiciously. "Why didn't the old witch let her go to her house?" "Maybe she thought it was the right thing to do," she said on the way back. "Maybe she sensed some kind of competition from her." Sharon was a doctor, after all. A real one. Michelle and Pamela never liked doctors. Sharon, left alone, hurried up to the porch of the hut and knocked quietly on the open door. There was no answer. Then she decided to go inside herself without invitation. The atmosphere inside was mystical. It was as if Sharon was visiting Baba Yaga herself. Everywhere hung bundles of various herbs, jars with incomprehensible potions, and a pungent aroma of juniper and spruce needles. The young woman went into the living room, hoping that the sick child was lying here somewhere. The room was rather ascetic: an old oak table, a couple of chairs, kerosene lamps, a chest of drawers, and a couple of framed photographs. One of them showed a certain girl in a dress similar to the ones used for burning the pancake effigy in spring. She stood in an embrace with a very old, wrinkled, like dried olives, woman. Apparently that was who Michelle and her daughter Pamela were. "My God, how old is Pamela then?" thought to herself an amazed Sharon. If it's true that her mother is 100 years old, then this woman is definitely a witch. She managed to have a baby, too. Sharon put the picture back and looked at the second picture. And that's when her inside snapped. "What are you doing here?" came from behind her in a chastening old man's voice. "If it were up to me, you'd be wandering in the swamps like this. Yes, it seems that now the situation is desperate. The taiga itself let you come to me." Sharon slowly turned to the witch doctor, meeting the gaze of her unkind black eyes like the eyes of a raven. Michelle was very petite, less than half Sharon's height, but she looked very determined and a little hostile. "Where did you get that?" Sharon asked, pointing to the second picture, where her Ryan stood with a bushy beard and long hair down. Sure, he'd changed a lot in appearance, more rugged, and his eyes were unkind. But it was definitely him. "You put that back," the old woman said. "It's not yours. It's not worth looking at." Sharon's lips quivered and her knees went weak, as wobbly as when she had tried to escape from the bandit. "I'm not doing anything until you tell me where you got that picture," Sharon almost shouted in the witch doctor's face. The woman tightened her immortal, dry lips a little. Then she answered, "You'd better ask him. Will you see him soon? Did he follow you into town too? We just missed each other. You know, that's your fate." Michelle sighed heavily and then asked with pressure, "So you're going to treat my child or not? What did I call you here for?" Sharon woke up as if from a long sleep. She was trembling inside. "Show me your granddaughter," the doctor nodded and followed her into a small room, the vault of which was even lower than the living room. Here in a tiny crib lay a pale little girl. Only her cheeks burned with an unusually bright blush. "Is that Kayla?" Sharon asked. "Take care of her right away," Michelle replied. "She's been getting worse since the third day. I don't know why my potions aren't working." "Yes, do you realize that your granddaughter has pneumonia?" Sharon asked her loudly, her eyes glittering. "The girl needs to be hospitalized immediately. Thank God Charlotte brought me to you. If you had, you would have lost the baby. Do you realize that?" The witch doctor's face crinkled like she'd taken a bite out of a sour apple. "Don't burn like that, do you understand?" The old woman replied obediently. "No, I'm just wondering where her mother is," Sharon asked, looking angrily at the old woman. "No, you should have let it go like that. All we have to do now is put her on a drip and pray for Kayla to come to her senses," Michelle said. The baby made a faint sound under the pediatrician's hands. "My God, she's burning up," the woman said, and pulled a syringe and a vial of medicine out of her case. "What are you going to inject her with?" Michelle asked, looking at the ampoule incredulously. "I won't let you operate on my granddaughter." And the herbalist blocked Sharon's access to the crib. "Calm down. This is the standard antipyretic used in such cases," Sharon replied, looking confidently into Michelle's eyes. The old woman hesitated, but still stepped back, allowing her granddaughter to be injected. "She should feel better now," Sharon said and looked at the witch doctor. "What are the normal words?" "You know, emergency? I need my granddaughter." "And how do I know what's in your heads, the newcomers?" asked her indignant tone witch doctor. "My adopted daughter went into the woods on the third day and never came back. Maybe it was your co-workers who took her for experiments. My girl, where are you now?" In the next moment, large tears rolled from Michelle's eyes. Sharon realized that the woman was no longer quite sane, and it would be better if she took the girl with her to the hospital. Behind all these thoughts, the pediatrician almost forgot the mysterious photo she saw at the old lady in the living room. However, in the next minute, the solution to this mystery appeared to her in person. "Doctor, is she all right?" Ryan asked with undisguised concern in his voice. "I called the elevator, but I almost fainted. I begged her to let me get a real doctor down here." Sharon turned cautiously toward the man, trying not to faint herself. Her lost spouse was standing right in front of her, looking exactly as he had in that photograph. "Ryan," she said, pale as a sheet. "Sharon, tell me it's true. Are you imagining things?" The man stared at her for a moment, uncomprehending. Then a spark of recognition flashed in his eyes, and then he grabbed the door to keep from collapsing to the floor. Memories rained down on his brain like a snowstorm. "Bill, what are you doing?" Old Michelle looked from Sharon to Ryan and back again. "Haven't you ever seen our village doctor?" "Why not? Is she the one who calls you Ryan? So that was your name in your previous life?" Then Michelle scrutinized Sharon, and only after that she said with dislike, "So it was you he called then in a fever. And I wondered why I didn't like you so much at once. How did I feel that you were connected? I just didn't realize it was so close that it stretched across the country." "Sharon, honey, it's me, Ryan. You're seeing things right, honey. How could I have forgotten?" In spite of the distance between them, Ryan took 2 wide strides to his weeping wife and squeezed her in a tight embrace. I knew you were alive, Ryan. I talked to you every night, prayed for you, felt that you hadn't crashed in the helicopter. But who did? What do you care about Michelle and Pamela? And how did you end up here?" Her husband looked at her with anxiety, but with boundless love, then said, "I will tell you everything for sure. Only please, let's first take my daughter to the hospital. I'm very worried about her condition." "Daughter?" Sharon said in amazement and pulled away from Ryan. "Pamela had a baby with you?" There was a moment of tense silence between the couple, but then Sharon managed to pull herself together and said, somewhat dryly, Yes, you're right, the child's life comes first. Taking the girl in his arms, the man hurried out of the hut. He easily led Sharon out of the woods and back to the village and carried his daughter directly to the hospital. When Kayla had been given all the help she needed and Sharon was sure that the little girl's life was no longer in danger, she sank tiredly onto the small couch in her office. "We can talk," Ryan said softly as he walked in. Sharon looked up at him, her eyes red with worry and tears. "Do we have anything else to talk about?" she asked in a colorless voice. The man walked carefully into the office and locked the door behind him. "Sharon, I have so much to tell you," he began. "But before I do, I want to assure you that if I could remember a single day of our life together, I would have come straight back to New York. I promise you." The woman smiled sadly in return. "I guess you had such a good time here that you didn't even have to remember anything. Nothing stirred in your soul while you were hiding with those forest witches." Her husband grabbed her hands and forced her to face him. "No, Sharon, you've got it all wrong. I just couldn't remember anything. You know I couldn't." And Ryan began his sad story. "I was blown into the river by a shockwave. I don't really remember how it happened. I just felt a strong jolt and a few seconds of free fall, and then cold and pain. When Michelle found me on the shore, I was badly mangled and unconscious. She and her daughter Pamela managed to drag me to her hut. And there," the man sighed nervously, "there I spent the next 6 months, barely regaining consciousness. Those women cured me, no matter what anyone says. Some of their potions have incredible healing powers. I don't know, maybe it was something like a coma, except when I finally woke up, I was a blank slate, you know? I didn't even remember my name, didn't know who I was." Ryan rubbed the bridge of his nose, as if he wanted to erase from his memory all the terrible things that had happened to him. Sharon listened without interrupting. She wanted to know the whole truth from him, all the way to the end. "I've been relearning how to walk. There's something wrong with my back, because I can't always keep my balance. But that's okay as long as you don't try to run too fast or carry too heavy a load. Pamela has been with me from the beginning. She nursed me, spoon-fed me. She brought me back to life. I'm sorry, but it's true." A bitter grin appeared on Sharon's face. "How touching." The woman silently admitted to herself that she was overcome with jealousy. "And then I started walking again solely because I had completely lost my memory. I decided to stay here for a while until I remembered who I was, and if I had a family. Naturally, I helped the women with their chores and hunted. But I did all that without leaving the woods, you know. Michelle led me to believe that I might be a fugitive. And then the police station would probably have an APB out on me." Ryan tried to explain to his wife. There was Sharon responded resignedly. "Only the APB had you listed as a missing person." Sharon covered her face with her hands, unable to take in all this information. "God, I've been looking for you for so long." "I'm alive," Ryan replied firmly. "I'm alive and I'm sitting here trying to explain everything to you." "How do you explain your daughter?" His wife brought him to the point. Ryan looked off into the distance, and for a moment he was transported into his own thoughts. "I love Kyla very much, and I want to take her with me when this is over and she's fully recovered." It was a moment of weakness. "Sharon, you have to understand, I didn't remember anything at all, and Michelle was so good to me. When she told me she was pregnant, I knew that whatever happened, I would take care of my daughter." His spouse turned away. She didn't want Ryan to see her face right now. Except Pamela was gone. "Karen?" The woman didn't understand. "Pamela's gone. Remember when Michelle said she'd gone into the woods and hadn't been home in 3 days? Well, I found her today." "What's wrong with her?" Sharon whispered with a bad feeling. "She's dead," Ryan replied shortly. "Oh my God," Sharon exclaimed, clamping her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. "How did this happen?" Her husband rubbed his palms, sweating with fear. Sharon had never seen him so frightened. "I guess she went to pick herbs and berries. So, anyway, it was a bear. I only recognized her by her dress, her basket. Sharon felt her feet go cold. "Michelle, are you going?" Ryan only shook his head. I suspected she'd already figured it out. She'd rather think her daughter drowned in the swamp than have me tell her such a terrible truth. They have a slightly different concept of death here. I buried Sabrina there, in the forest, so Michelle, God willing, will not stumble upon her. The taiga gives and takes back. Michelle said she found Sabrina as a lonely teenager. She was supposedly hiding in the woods from her stepfather. So she took her in. You don't regret her? She was a really nice person, Ryan said quietly. What can I do now that I found out about her like that? Sharon felt shame burning inside her. Alas, it was only after the news of Pamela's death that she had been able to see her as the person who had saved her husband's life, not as an insidious rival. Sharon? Ryan asked her quietly. Can we get out of here as soon as Kayla's better? We will. You can forgive me, right? Sharon looked into her husband's blue eyes and made the only decision she could make. Of course, Ryan. I'm still your wife, and I'll always be your wife. And so it was. As soon as little Kayla recovered, Ryan and Sharon quickly packed for the road and were ready to take a bus that evening to the nearest airport, where they could be flown to the mainland by helicopter. And then they could take a regular airplane to New York City. Ryan wanted to go to say goodbye to Susan as he was stunned by Charlotte's tragic news. It turns out that the old healer was gone the night before. Apparently could not survive the disappearance of her daughter, suggested the milkmaid then, and no one knew exactly how old Michelle was. Sharon even wept when she learned of the old woman's death. No matter how she felt about her and her unconventional methods of treatment, she never wished her a similar fate. Don't worry, Sharon, Charlotte assured her. We'll give her a proper Christian burial. The pediatrician thanked the kind countrywoman and, after saying goodbye to everyone except Vincent's annoying paramedic, left with her husband and Kayla back to the capital. When they returned home, the first thing they did was to officially adopt little Kayla and restore all of Ryan's papers. Sharon's parents were happy to learn that their son-in-law was alive after all. They threw a big party for the occasion, and Kayla became the long-awaited granddaughter who came to them almost 10 years after their daughter's wedding. Ryan went back to work in rescue, but due to an injury he could no longer work in the field, so he went back to where he once started. He now counsels and trains young lifeguards. Now he is full of strength and energy, and wants to make his life more calm and measured, directing most of his time to raising his daughter and his beloved wife. Sharon, on the other hand, continued her work at the clinic. Returning to her former duties, she, as before, treats children. Only now she has her own little daughter waiting for her at home, whom she loves more than life, and for whom she thanks God every day. So, having gone through a series of difficult trials, the Clark family finally found a second chance for happiness. And this time they are not going to miss it. Barbara worked as an editor at a publishing house. On another Thursday, just before lunchtime, her smartphone started ringing. On the screen she saw the words "Mom." Although calls during work were not a frequent occurrence, Barbara didn't expect anything bad. She figured her mom just missed her or wanted advice on clothing choices. Barbara answered the phone. As soon as she heard her mom's voice, she immediately knew something was wrong. The voice was strange, muffled. "Barbara, honey, don't worry, please," Mom said. "I'm at the hospital right now." "Mommy, what happened? What hospital are you in? What did the doctors say? What do you need to bring? What's the room number?" Barbara asked her questions. "Barbara, please don't worry," the voice answered. "It's just like in the movie. I slipped and fell and was passed out. But I'm fine." Gabriella, a neighbor, was walking by. She helped me and supported me while we waited for the ambulance. The doctor said I'd be fine, but I'd be in the hospital for a while. "Mom, why didn't you tell me before? Mom, why didn't you tell me? I would have rushed to help." "I didn't want to interrupt you in the middle of the day. Mom, but tonight 4 to 7 p.m. is visiting hours. I was afraid if you went home first, then to the pharmacy, you might not make it. Please write down what you need to bring. The main things are a policy, a cell phone charger, and non-carbonated water. For some reason I'm very thirsty." Her mother sighed, and Barbara imagined her face contorted with pain. She hurried to end the conversation by asking for the number of the hospital and the room. Barbara reread the list of things her mother had dictated to her. Yes, Barbara had peed chicken broth in it and used wet wipes. And on wobbly legs, she went to ask her boss, Jack. "Please allow me to leave early today, for personal reasons. My mom's in the hospital," Barbara said. The boss, a friend of Barbara's husband's from his student days, expressed polite words of sympathy. When he learned which hospital the subordinate's mother was in, he cheered her up and asked, "But the doctors at our regional clinic are good. Maybe the atmosphere is not too luxurious, but the equipment and staff are top-notch. I've been in this hospital several times. I was discharged as good as new. So you're going to be fine. By the way, are you driving today, or is Matthew driving? Maybe Eden can give you a ride in the car." Barbara was touched by her boss's concern and decided that she was in no position to refuse. "Thank you, Jack. That would be very helpful. I'm not keeping the driver long. I just need to get to my mom's house, that's all. I won't keep Eden any longer. I'll get my things there and then call a cab. Thank you." The manager wished Barbara success and promised, "Come out in 15 minutes to the main entrance. I'll tell Eden to wait for you at your mother's house and give you a ride to your family home. He's coming back for me anyway. Is your house on the way?" Thanking her sensitive boss again, Barbara went to turn off her computer and clean up her workplace. She took the contract with her so that she wouldn't let the whole team down and complete the necessary work by the next morning. The woman badly perceived the meaning of the jokes with which the driver tried to entertain her. But even she was grateful that the flow of his speeches made her at least react somehow and prevented her from sinking into anxious thoughts. Following the list, ticking off each recorded item with a check mark, Barbara packed up her mother's apartment, watering her favorite flowers. She shut off the gas and water just in case, checked to make sure there were no perishables in the refrigerator, picked up the trash to throw out. Only then did Barbara go downstairs and set off with her driver, Eden. Not far from Barbara and Matthew's house was a supermarket with a pharmacy department inside. The woman decided to stop there on the way, asking Eden to pull over near the container yard. She threw out the garbage she had collected and rushed to get her groceries. Moving almost on autopilot, Barbara bought everything she needed and was soon preparing dinner for her husband and broth for her mother at the same time. While the food was boiling and baking, she called Matthew and explained the situation. "Matthew, Mom is in the hospital. I'm going to go see her. I'm not sure how long she'll be there. Dinner will be on the stove." My husband replied, "I'm aware of that. Jack told me you needed support. You wait for me, I'll try to get there early, and we'll go to the hospital together. See if there's anything else you need, and I'll be there for you." Matthew didn't let his wife down and took her and the 2 bags she had packed and drove her to the hospital. Barbara managed to persuade the nurse taking the bags to let her see her mother and the doctor, who was fortunately there. Matthew remained waiting for his wife in the lobby, but gave her kind words and wishes for a speedy recovery. Audrey tried to smile when she saw Barbara enter the room, but it was noticeable that she was uncomfortable and frightened. Barbara said a soft but distinctive hello to everyone in the room and made her way to her mother's bedside. A weight was suspended from the unfortunate woman's right leg. Her lips, swollen almost to the point of bleeding, were a clear indication that the victim of the ice had been in great pain. Barbara listened to her mother's account of her accident and, trying not to cry, began to put everything she had brought into the nightstand. The phone was immediately put on charge. She gave her mother tea with jam, broth, made her eat a few spoonfuls of raw, grated carrots. The internet says that such a salad in the first days after injury the best vitamin remedy. Then I'll give you some sauerkraut. It's good for you, too, Barbara said. Oh, don't worry, my daughter. You should probably go home, Matthew. He's probably worried you're gone, Audrey said. Barbara explained that her husband had rushed home when he heard what had happened so she wouldn't have to take a cab, but he hadn't been missed. But he said hello, as if he'd just been waiting for that line. The woman lying in the next bed became active. Sanitarians, nurses here are rude, boorish women. And you interfere in the conversation. It is impossible to call them neither day nor night. They serve teas, make fun of doctors, give chocolates. Even giving them money is useless. They're not even doing their job properly anyway. Barbara kept silent, and having found out from her mother the name and patronymic of her attending doctor, went in search of him. The restless neighbor also made a good point. In the residence room, if not, then in the dressing room, look there, probably with someone cooing keen. Thanking the nagging woman dryly, Barbara went out into the corridor. The nurses in the trauma room, accustomed to all sorts of relatives, tears and hysterics, looked at the visitor, asking how to find a doctor with a mixture of irritation and fatigue. But one of them, who held herself like a superior, answered thoroughly. Patrick is now in the superintendent's office, the penultimate door at that end of the corridor. Wait there. Or you can sit on the bench near the residence room. Barbara waited for the doctor, and he recognized her as Audrey's daughter. He invited her into the office, showing her the picture on the computer screen. If I may say so, your mother's fracture was a success, Patrick explained. In general, there are 2 treatment options. The man began to explain the nuances of each option, then asked, "Which one did you decide on?" Barbara looked the doctor in the eyes, but did not answer, but asked a counter question. Say, Patrick, for example, if a patient with the same fracture as my mom had a loved one, what would you recommend? Smiling, the doctor replied briefly. A similar case was with my aunt. Our superintendent performed a similar operation on her a year ago, and as she now leads an active life, even works at the cottage, so I cannot keep up with her. The woman clarified all the details of the upcoming surgery, wrote down what else should be brought for the postoperative period, and having said goodbye to the doctor, left the office. Barbara had to announce to her mother that the surgery was scheduled for the next day, and she presented the news as lightly as possible, trying not to disturb her mother. Tomorrow I'll go and meet you. You'll be fine after the operation, don't worry. Barbara, what about your job? The boss is probably going to be mad, Audrey asked. Don't worry about that. I'll do all the work and I won't let you or the chief down. With the surgery, the long road to getting Audrey walking again had just begun. For 2 weeks, Barbara visited her mother almost daily to feed and nurse her. The woman tried to object and repeatedly stated, Barbara, you take care of yourself. Don't come to see me so often. The food here is not bad, and I have no appetite. Where would it come from if my energy is not used for anything? But Audrey couldn't change her daughter's mind. When the day of discharge arrived, Barbara went to the doctor's office for recommendations. Patrick was cautious and warned. Your mom is a very energetic lady, but I've made my point, and I'll make it to you again. I wouldn't be overly optimistic if I were you, but there's no need to despair, although you can't use your injured limb for full weight bearing. Crutches are your mom's best friend for the next month. And then you have to be careful too. Of course, it is necessary to move, but carefully. Prophylactic treatments are indicated to prevent bed sores. In 6 weeks, I'll be waiting for a follow-up X-ray. We'll see what stage of fusion the bone will be in. That's pretty much it. Barbara asked. Maybe some vitamins for Mom to take? Patrick shrugged. Well, in principle, you could. But in general, you should be told about the rehabilitation plan at the polyclinic where you live. Barbara called a special cab specializing in the transportation of people with limited mobility. And after a heroic trek through the streets, Audrey was finally in her apartment. Barbara faced a new problem. Audrey's physical condition still left much to be desired. Even a simple trip to the restroom or kitchen could result in a new injury. At first, Barbara came to Audrey's house twice a day, and closer to the New Year's holidays, she was practically exhausted. The traffic jams were so time-consuming that there were only a few hours left for sleep. Barbara turned to her husband. Matthew, let's let Mom stay with us for a while. At least I won't have to go back and forth between apartments. The man answered grimly, and after a quick pause, Barbara, I feel wonderful about your mother. Audrey is a wonderful woman, but I'm sorry. But I'm going to be blunt, we have nowhere to put her here. I mean, it's a studio apartment. It's a big room, but there's only one room. When I talked you into taking out a mortgage, I didn't get any sympathy. Both you and your mom were against it. Matthew, there's got to be some kind of a screen. It'd be like having two rooms. Look, but Audrey would be the first thing that would be uncomfortable. I play computer games loudly. I listen to music all night. Besides, you should ask her if she'd be willing to move. I'm 100% sure she'll say no. Your mom is very tactful and wise and realizes that the further away she lives, the better her relationship with her son-in-law will be. Matthew turns out to be right. Audrey, having barely heard the idea of moving into her son-in-law and daughter's apartment, only exclaimed indignantly, "There can't even be a conversation. At home and the walls help. I will not go to your place, especially there, and it will be inconvenient to be sick in peace." Barbara obeyed her mother's will. She didn't want to argue with her husband. She continued to waste time standing in traffic and left the place of a lawyer in Jack's firm. With the permission of her boss, Barbara transferred to a half-time position and was very glad that the manager was able to meet her needs. She prepared the contracts during the visit and trained her smart girl, and diligently performed all the duties that did not require constant presence in the office. The rehab, however, took a lot more money than the woman had realized. Sometimes she shared with her husband her indignation at the fact that pharmacies changed prices at will and tried to sell the most expensive version of a drug. And then Matthew would grumble. "Look, Barbara, your mother must have some free medication." The woman tried not to answer. After all, the family budget did not suffer, and money from her husband for almost 6 months since the fateful news of her mother's troubles, she did not ask. Barbara had generally tried to handle the situation on her own, without Matthew's interference. The weather was changing. Barbara's schedule remained almost unchanged by the tradition that had formed. In the morning, she would make her husband breakfast and, if she had time, make preparations for lunch and dinner. Then, after putting some of the breakfast in containers, she would rush to her mother's house, stopping at stores and pharmacies along the way. Taking care of her, keeping her spirits up, and helping her move around the apartment took a lot of time. Barbara would then run to the office and rush home by evening in case of any emergencies. Her neighbor, the same Gabriella who had helped her wait for the ambulance, had the key to her mother's apartment. She would sometimes drop by to watch TV and gossip together, so Audrey couldn't be called abandoned. But Barbara was desperate to get her mom back on her feet, and not just because she had to spend a lot of time traveling between very distant parts of the city every day, without weekends and holidays. It was just that Mom was the closest person to her. She had, in fact, given Barbara life twice. The first time was on her birthday 38 years ago, but more importantly later when a terrible tragedy struck Barbara in a terrible avalanche. It was her mother who was there for her in those black days, helped her to move around when her legs almost collapsed due to nervousness, forced her to drink and eat, then by persuasion, then by force. Abandoning her monetary and not dusty work, my mother sold the apartment in their hometown and, almost as a huge and clumsy cule, moved it 2,000 kilometers away from the place where everything Barbara reminded her of her inhuman grief. It was Audrey who had forced her to take a job where it was almost impossible to be alone with her sad thoughts, where she had to look stylish and trim. Barbara did not consider her help to her mother as self-sacrifice and, despite her fatigue, tried to surround her husband with care. Moreover, the 10-year wedding anniversary was approaching, and the woman wanted to organize a touching congratulation and a pleasant surprise for patient Matthew. She made a preliminary version of the menu in advance. She found a confectionery where orders were made on individual designs and agreed to prepare an unusual figurative cake for her husband. "I love his sweets," Barbara said. The holiday was approaching, but shortly before it arrived, Matthew, during his morning breakfast, warned, "Sorry, Barbara, but I need a car for a few days. I have to go to the branch office in the neighboring region because something seems to be going on there with the branch manager's reports. Profits are down by leaps and bounds. Although in other divisions everything is even, and in some places even growth is observed. Of course, I'll try to make a quick trip, but airplanes are unlikely to fly in those parts, and I don't feel like taking the train. Can you manage without a car?" Although Barbara herself was counting on the faithful family horse, she didn't argue. After all, her husband really needed the car more. She smiled. "I'll manage, of course." Matthew thanked her politely for breakfast and promised, "Nothing, we'll buy you an iron horse a little later. The situation at work will normalize, and you'll choose a model. Running out of the house, the man kissed his wife on the cheek, winked and said, "Don't worry, I remember our wedding anniversary. I'll try to be there Friday night." Taking advantage of her husband's absence, Barbara moved to her mother's house for a while, so as not to waste time on the road. During these few days, she had time to do a general cleaning, and the apartment was somehow especially fresh in spring. Only on the eve of the holiday, Barbara had to return home. To bring to the office, she urgently needed a diploma. However, it was even better, because she had to clean up the house and prepare some of Matthew's favorite salads. In the morning, the woman took the holiday treats that had been put aside in separate containers and rushed to her mother's house. She habitually gave her a massage, helped her walk around her room, and even after waiting for the elevator repairs to be completed, finally took her mother outside so she could rejoice in the nice weather and enjoy the feeling of life returning to the way it was before the injury. After a short walk, Audrey and Barbara had lunch, and the daughter began to apologize. "Mommy, you'll have to excuse me, please. I'm going to leave early today. I want to surprise Matthew. Turn off the TV when you get bored. Your cell phone's charged. Call me if you need anything, okay?" "Run, Barbara. Happy holidays and cheers." Wow, 10 years together. She kissed her mom, and Barbara ran along the route she'd planned. Spring, which had long ago entered its rights and was rapidly approaching summer, gave soft warmth, and the sweet and tart aroma of blossoming lilac set the mood for the most romantic mood. Contrary to popular belief that marriage in May portended trouble, she did not have to suffer in her second marriage. On the contrary, Matthew was for a woman a safe haven. There were no violent passions between them, but there was mutual sympathy and respect. Barbara appreciated her husband for the fact that he did not pry into her soul, did not pester her with jealousy and suspicion, did not demand to give birth to an heir or heiress. It was only when he announced his serious intentions that Barbara warned him directly and honestly that children were not part of her plans. The man was not frightened by this statement. A few years after the wedding, Matthew asked if she had changed her mind about the child. But having heard a categorical no, did not begin to find out the reasons and did not raise this topic again. The man was a good partner, and of course she loved him in her own way, with all the strength her wounded heart was capable of. Following the list she'd made the day before, Barbara bought drinks, picked up the calamari Matthew adored. And so she bought little things: a crusty baguette, fresh green salad, fruit. The 2 large shopping bags that Barbara had thoughtfully brought with her were gradually filling up. Having hung them on both shoulders, she ran into the pastry shop where she had ordered a cake. Now it was time to go home. As she approached the driveway, Barbara looked hopefully at the family parking space and breathed a sigh of relief there was no car. So she would have time to set the table, hang the balloons, and dress up before her husband returned. Praising herself mentally for the handy bags, thanks to which one hand was free, the woman hurriedly opened the door and finally found herself in the family nest. Placing the box with the cake on the banquet, Barbara suddenly froze with surprise. The familiar hum of a residential apartment building was brazenly interfered with by a foreign sound coming from the kitchen. Strangely, there were no foreign shoes on the mat. There were no foreign things visible, but the clatter of dishes came to her quite clearly, as if someone had moved a massive plate or a bulky mug. Matthew and Barbara kept no pets. All they wanted was a cute dog. An unfortunate accident with their mom had tweaked that plan. It probably would have been much smarter to go out to the playground, close the door, and call her husband. But from fatigue, Barbara didn't act as safety dictated. Automatically pulling her sneakers off her feet, and with her bag squarely on her shoulders, the woman walked into the kitchen and nearly collapsed with surprise, tucking one leg under her. On a chair sat a boy of about 6 years of age. The unknown little guest was completely engrossed in his meal. On the table in front of him was Matthew's huge mug, a bottle of water, and a large deep plate into which Barbara had assembled the puffed salad from the evening before, so that it would have time to soak. A spoon sticking out from the edge clearly indicated that the dish had already been unceremoniously sampled. The child bit into the stick of cheese and smoked sausage with gusto, and the woman's heart clenched as the memories came flooding back. It was too painful to act rationally. For a few seconds, Barbara even thought she was hallucinating because of overwork or some other reason. However, the sight, the sound, the image, and even the aroma of the sausage were too realistic. The engrossed boy broke away from his tasty pastime only after Barbara, in a voice a little hoarse from nervous shock, caught his attention with a question. "Hello, who are you? And what are you doing here?" The boy jumped up from his chair and, without letting go of the sausage, reported. "My name is Roger. Uncle Matthew brought me here. Told him to wait here. Said I could eat whatever I wanted. So I'm eating. It's good sausage, but it's very salty." Barbara had no idea that the man the boy called Uncle Matthew wasn't her husband. There was no such incredible coincidence as in a traditional New Year's Eve movie, when the hero didn't realize he'd opened someone else's apartment with his own keys, and was completely unconcerned by the typical furnishings of a standard apartment. Barbara could safely vouch for the fact that it wasn't easy to find even a closely similar design as in her and her husband's place. Surely there must be a logical explanation for the boy's appearance in the kitchen, the woman thought. She herself, having married Matthew, had become Davies, and Roger's last name meant absolutely nothing to her. Her husband was the only child of his parents, but he had cousins, as far as Barbara knew. Except they hadn't been invited to the modest wedding, and she didn't know them by face or surname. So it was quite possible that the Roger sitting before her was the child of one of her husband's cousins. But why had he, without even warning, suddenly brought this boy to their apartment? Shaken out of her psychological equilibrium, Barbara couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she hadn't even had time to think of any plausible version when Matthew called. Coming out of her daze, Barbara finally took the bags off her shoulders and took the call. The man began to speak quickly, literally not letting his wife get a word in edgewise. "Love, you and I just missed each other by a little bit. I've just left Audrey's apartment, and I'll be there in 20 minutes to explain everything to you. Set the table." Okay, the confused woman cheered up a little and replied briefly. She felt Roger's gaze on her very clearly, but she could not find the strength to look him in the eye. The woman brought from the hallway her new slippers, just recently purchased in anticipation of the approaching summer season, and suggested, "Roger, you have sneakers. It's hot at home. Keep your flip-flops. Put them on. It will be more comfortable and convenient." The child silently obeyed. To defuse the situation and occupy the boy thrown to her, but at the same time to avoid having to talk to him a lot, Barbara asked, "Roger, do you know how to inflate balloons?" The boy nodded. The woman quickly went to the room and brought the child a whole package of balloons. Then, obeying some impulse, she licked the tips through which Roger was to inflate the balloons and handed them to him, asking, "Don't inflate too much. When you get tired, rest, and I'll help you tie them. Deal?" The child nodded dutifully and, without feeling any embarrassment, asked, "And what's your name?" "Barbara." There was silence in the kitchen. The boy, thinking about something, was busy with the marbles. Barbara kept an eye on her guest and began to sort through the bags, prepare what was planned, and gradually set the table. She put the cake in the refrigerator and, distracted by tying the inflated balloons, felt a pinch of pain rather than irritation. She wasn't angry with her husband, but her mind was spinning incessantly with all sorts of thoughts. The woman felt the curious gaze of the little guest, but did not dare to look him in the eye. So they looked at each other, but hardly spoke to each other. Barbara did not notice how Matthew came into the kitchen with a huge bouquet of roses in his hands and a large bag. The man put the bag on the floor and handed the flowers to his wife. "Barbara, congratulations to you and myself on our holiday. I see that you and Roger have already made friends. That's wonderful. Well then, let's celebrate." The boy was visibly cheerful, and after Matthew appeared, he said modestly, "Congratulations." And when everyone sat down at the table after the inevitable fuss, he boasted loudly, "Uncle Matthew, I inflated the balloons myself and Barbara helped me tie them. That's a nice surprise we got for you." The grown man mumbled something inaudible in response, praising Roger and his wife, who hadn't even touched the food. There was tension in the apartment, and Matthew set about remedying the situation. He softly turned on the music and began to enthusiastically praise the dishes his wife had prepared. Then he made a toast to Barbara's beauty and charm. He took a box out of his pocket, handed it to her, and said, "Congratulations. I hope you like it." The woman, confused in her assumptions and thoughts about why her husband had brought a child to the apartment, only now remembered her gift. Leaving the not-too-cheerful company for a while, Barbara, clutching the unopened box in the palm of her hand, took out the hidden present. Returning to the table, she handed the package to her husband and confined herself to a parsimonious phrase. "In honor of your wedding anniversary." Matthew hastily tore the wrapping paper, marveled at the pewter mug, and began to show the gift to Roger. The woman felt uncomfortable and sank back into her thoughts. Not at all how she had envisioned the wedding anniversary celebration. She had wanted to prepare a surprise, but her husband had managed not only to surprise her, but to throw her completely off balance in the most natural way. Barbara coughed violently from surprise, choking on her mineral water, when she heard the question addressed to her. "Barbara, Roger's going to stay with us for a couple of weeks, okay?" Matthew said. Barbara was silent, not knowing what to say. Matthew tried to justify himself. "I stopped by Audrey's to pick you up on my way home. I wanted to explain everything to you, but I didn't have time. It was a surprise. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I was sure that I would pick you up at your mom's and tell you on the way that we had a guest." Matthew's monologue ended in a long silence. Barbara moved the food on her plate with her fork without looking up at her husband. He, confused, didn't know what else to say for himself. With childlike directness, Roger broke into the silence by asking, "Aunt Barbara, thank you. I've already eaten. Can I have some cake now?" The boy showed the empty plate, and with a stony face, Barbara got up from the chair and went to the refrigerator. She wanted to scream, stomp her feet, and sob. Her faith in her husband's honesty was shaken. But she knew it wouldn't make it any easier. The most likely explanation for Matthew's bringing Roger to the apartment seemed to be that he had been unfaithful. With all her being, Barbara now hated the man she had loved for 10 years as much as she knew how. Matthew, who knew his wife well, guessed from her impulsive movements that she would say what was on her mind. So he decided to take the little guest away from the table to a sitting area where he could distract himself from the upcoming serious adult conversation. "Roger, come on, I'll turn on the game console. True, my games are mostly complex, but we can find something to your taste on the internet, or cartoons if you want." "Are you allowed to eat cake there?" asked the boy. "Of course you can eat anything," Matthew said. The boy's eyes sparkled, and he trustingly followed the owner of the apartment to the cozy, soft corner. Barbara, having heard the conversation between her husband and the guest, cut a large piece of cake, carefully placed it on a plate, turned on the electric kettle, and carefully watched it boil. The click of the kettle turning off brought Barbara out of her reverie. She was making tea. The woman placed a cup of the delicious beverage, sugar and spoon, and a plate of cake on a tray, then carried it to a table near the play area of the apartment. Matthew was showing Roger a collection of computer games, but the boy, who was clearly well-mannered, broke away from the fascinating activity and thanked. "Thank you very much." Barbara nodded and turned and walked away. When Matthew came into the kitchen, he found Barbara sitting on the floor, holding a pair of children's sneakers. Tears were rolling down her cheeks. The man tried to make a joke. "Barbara, what's wrong with you?" A child with dirty shoes walked into the kitchen. "Now, robot vacuum cleaner, turn on, let him work. It's no big deal. It's nothing. Why get upset over a little dust? Especially since it's a holiday." Barbara looked at her husband in a way that made him uncomfortable and said quietly, "Matthew, I think I've told you repeatedly that I don't want to be in the same space with the children for too long. It's beyond me. There must have been good reasons for what you did, or, as you put it, for the surprise. And you're understandable. But I'm sorry, I don't have the slightest desire to deal with any of this today. I'm going to go to my mother's and stay with her for a while." Matthew could not understand the reason for such a categorical decision of his wife, but he saw that Barbara was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so he suggested, "Barbara, I'm really very guilty for not warning you, but I can explain everything. I think that when you hear me out, you'll realize that I couldn't have done anything differently. I'll wait until you're ready to talk." Suddenly, the woman gently put down the children's sneakers, wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and went to the door, as if she hadn't heard her husband. Matthew took his wife's hand and asked, "Barbara, wait a minute. I'll call a cab to Audrey's house so I don't have to worry about you." Barbara nodded and was soon in the cab car. She was holding her purse in her hands. The road was clear, and it took much less time to get to her mom's house than it did during peak hours. As soon as the woman opened the door, she heard, "Gabriella, come in, dear. I'm not feeling very well." Barbara closed the door behind her and went straight into her mother's bedroom. Audrey was alarmed to see her daughter. "Barbara, what are you doing back? Didn't Matthew come home? By my reckoning, your wedding anniversary celebration should be in full swing. And you're here for some reason. Daughter, what's wrong?" Barbara walked over to her mother's bed, sat down on the floor, and leaned her head against Audrey's palm and told her everything that had happened since she had come home and seen Roger there. When she had finished her story, Barbara made her suggestion. "Mom, I'm pretty sure Roger is Matthew's illegitimate son. The boy looks to be about 6 years old. So my husband cheated on me and had the nerve to show me evidence of his infidelity on our wedding anniversary." Audrey tried to reassure her daughter. "I'm sure Matthew can explain everything. I can feel that he loves you. Believe my experience, he would hardly risk his relationship with you and cheat." Barbara, however, cried without stopping. Audrey stroked her so mature but defenseless daughter, but no more words were spoken because they were all powerless. Finally, when the flow of tears dried up, Barbara silently got up from the floor and went to wash her face swollen with tears. The woman felt completely devastated. Returning to her mother's room, Barbara confessed, "I'm very tired for today, and I don't mind lying down." Audrey did not object and suggested, for example, to talk some more and have dinner. She realized that her unhappy daughter needed to rest. "Of course, Barbara, but let's get you and me something to calm you down." "Of course, Barbara. Valerian, at least. It would do you and me good." Barbara complied with her mother's request and went to bed. The nervous tension was so intense that the woman passed out and woke up when the clock read 10. She jumped up on the couch and rushed to the kitchen, where she caught Audrey's mother preparing the batter for pancakes. "Good morning, daughter. You're just in time. Are we having breakfast now?" The women made pancakes in 4 hands and, as if they were in agreement, never said a word about yesterday's situation. As Barbara was washing the dishes, Audrey asked, "Daughter, please go to the theater with Gabriella. She has 2 tickets to a very good play, great seats in the parlor. Her niece gave them to her for her birthday. They were supposed to go together. And then, as luck would have it, her niece got sick. The rest of the family can't keep Gabriella company. Some of them are called away on country plots, some are on a business trip. So the ticket's gone. It's a shame." Barbara shook her head. "Mommy, I don't want to go anywhere. I'm not in the mood." However, if Audrey had something on her mind, she knew how to insist on her own. "That's why you should go, because you're not in the mood. Art is great at switching thoughts in your head and changing emotions. Please, daughter, not for the sake of the missing ticket, but for me. I want to." Barbara had to comply with her mother's wish. However, she refused the offer to run to the hairdresser beforehand and get a new haircut. After waiting for Gabriella to take Barbara away, Audrey called her son-in-law and said in an almost commanding tone, "Matthew, Barbara won't be here until about 3 p.m. Come over, we need to talk." The man did not resist, but warned, "Audrey, I'll be there, but I don't have anyone to leave Roger with. I don't think I can find a nanny, but I wouldn't trust the boy to someone I don't know, so I can only come with him. Do you mind?" The woman sighed. "I don't mind." "Me? Great. Then Roger and I will be at your place in half an hour." 30 minutes later, Audrey, carefully reaching the door, leaning on a walker, let Matthew and Roger into the apartment. The man introduced the child, and the boy Roger said a polite hello. Mistress Audrey tried not to betray her incredible excitement and hospitably invited Roger into the kitchen. "Come in. I have a TV and cakes waiting for you. Do you want cocoa or tea?" The child announced that he tastes most delicious coffee, but it is not allowed for children to drink this drink often, and he will drink tea because he is too old for cocoa. Audrey almost laughed out of surprise, but she got her emotions under control in time and, turning to Matthew, asked, "Can we give Roger some tea too?" And she was more like a treat. It's almost like coffee. The boy rejoiced. "I want to try this drink. Matthew, may I?" And Matthew said yes. As the hostess deftly prepared the treat for Roger, the man handed the boy his smartphone and explained, "I need to talk to Audrey. You, please stay here. Eat the treats, play on your phone, maybe even watch some videos on the internet for a bit." "Good, sure, where there are words. I'm perfectly capable of being unsupervised, don't worry." Observing this picture, Audrey could barely restrain herself from crying. Hiding her emotions, she slowly walked toward the room, which was old-fashionedly called the hall. Matthew followed her, eager to find out what Audrey wanted to talk to him about. The woman sat down in an armchair, and the man sat on a sofa across from it, so that the conversation could be carried on comfortably. The hostess looked at her son-in-law attentively, but he did not endure long and asked without preamble, "Audrey, will you explain to me why Barbara reacted so inadequately to Roger's appearance in our apartment? Will I admit my guilt if anything I did not warn her? But we're adults. Instead of having a calm conversation, she basically just ran to you. Is that normal?" The woman did not interrupt the indignant speech of her son-in-law, but his question was not in a hurry to answer, and asked a counter-question. "Before I start a difficult conversation to try to help my daughter to keep the family, I need to be sure that it makes sense. Tell me the truth, Matthew. Is Roger your illegitimate son?" The man's outrage was unparalleled. "No, of course not. I've never thought of cheating on Barbara. I love her very much, I respect her, but her attitude towards children is starting to scare me. Roger was in our apartment because of a desperate situation. But Barbara didn't even try to get along with him. Although, as you may have noticed, he is a well-mannered, bright, and charming boy." Matthew's answer calmed the worried Audrey, and taking a deep breath, as if preparing to make a parachute jump, she decided to tell her son-in-law the truth. "What is it?" "All things secret, as they say, come to light. As a husband, you have the right to know why my daughter avoids contact with children. I think I have the right to tell you her story, which at first seemed like a happy fairy tale, and then turned into a terrible nightmare that destroyed the usual life. Barbara grew up a wonderful and clever girl, and was a real joy for me and my husband. We had no problem to arrange her to study in one of the best gymnasiums in our city. The income of our family and the positions held by me and my husband allowed Barbara to be her own among the same, as they say, golden youth. However, the gymnasium had a very strong teaching staff, and grades were not for sale, as you might think. Children were skillfully interested in learning, and our Barbara was one of the best students in the class. She was even made a tutor for her desk mate Frank. The boy was from a very good family, quite influential in our town. His dad was a district attorney, and his mom was in the same department in the last position. In general, they lived better than our family, but they didn't hinder the development of their son's friendship with Barbara. They welcomed her wholeheartedly. They did not talk to me and my husband through the lip, but quite kindly. When Barbara was in 10th grade, her father died suddenly. A blood clot had broken, according to the autopsy. It was Frank's family that supported Barbara and me after this loss. I still thank them for that, because I was in such a state that I almost went to my husband. So of course I didn't mind at all when Barbara decided to marry Frank. So what if they were just over 18 at the time? Obviously, you can't stand in the way of real feelings. Frank's parents didn't mind either and were even happy to have my daughter as part of their family. A year after the wedding, Barbara and Frank had twins, 2 boys, Adam and Henry. Healthy, cheerful, and strong, they grew up and made us all happy. Barbara couldn't get enough of her babies. You know, Matthew, she used to tell me that she was walking, rolling the stroller in front of her, and her heart was ready to jump out of her chest every now and then. Of course, I helped whenever I could. My mother-in-law repeatedly suggested that Barbara hire a reliable nanny, but my daughter refused every time and mostly managed on her own. God knows what it cost her, but she did not give up her university studies, and even without a sabbatical leave managed to do without. And her father-in-law put her in a prestigious and well-paid job in such a position that the working day was strictly rationed, There was a social package and other benefits. He had the opportunity, of course. And he was not ashamed to patronize his daughter-in-law. Barbara was smart. When the boys were 6, my daughter became pregnant again. Frank welcomed the news with joy, and why should he? It was a wonderful family relationship. As far as I know, there's never been a fight between them. It was like the two halves were lucky enough to be united as a whole. I know a lot of people were jealous, and some of the ladies tried to have an affair with Frank. But he didn't want anyone but my daughter. Everything was so perfect, I never thought it would all come crashing down overnight because of a terrible tragedy. Barbara, of course, had to see a doctor. And Frank volunteered to pick up his sons from daycare. By a ridiculous coincidence, his car broke down that day, and he decided not to call a cab, but to take the children home through the park. The weather was beautiful, and although the rides were not yet open, there was a pizzeria at the exit of the park that the boys were eager to go to. Frank met a buddy on the way, and while he was talking to him, the kids scattered. They ran out onto the lake, but the march ice was treacherously thin. My grandchildren, as witnesses later told me, didn't even have time to scream. They went under in a flash. Frank and his buddy rushed to the pond. But no luck. Only the divers who arrived at the scene of the tragedy managed to catch the boys. Frank later tried to justify himself, like a clockwork, constantly repeating that he was distracted only for a few seconds. What's the use? Our boys had drowned. There was no fixing it. My son-in-law was the first to tell me this bitter news because he was afraid for Barbara, and for good reason. I went to the private clinic where I knew Barbara was at the time. My heart told me that it was better to have doctors close by when the worst of grief came upon my daughter. Seeing me in the hallway, Barbara must have realized everything by the look on my face. She was hysterical after hearing the news. Barbara could not be calmed down, even with a large dose of medication. She never went home that night. She ended up in the hospital with a nervous breakdown. My daughter was worried about her dead sons and was unable to save the baby that was developing under her heart. The doctors didn't even consider him a baby yet, and she had already lost him. At Adam and Henry's funeral, Barbara stood like a stone statue. No tears, no emotion. Pale as death. Especially frightening was the emptiness in her eyes. Frank was no less worried. In his 25 years, he tried to take Barbara's hand for support, but she shied away from him like a leper. She never again crossed the threshold of the apartment where she lived with her husband and sons. How many times Frank had tried to talk to her, I couldn't count. Only it never worked. Barbara just cut her husband out of her life. Frank's mom came to us when she realized my daughter didn't want to see or hear from her husband. She was on her knees, begging me to forgive her son, saying he wasn't himself. I shared my sad thoughts that he was on the verge of leaving this world. But Barbara didn't react. She could never forgive her husband for the death of her sons. Frank could not forgive himself either. Indeed, he had turned from a blossoming man into a pale semblance of his former self. Barbara predictably quit her job, seemingly of her own accord. But in fact, everyone realized that she simply could not be under everyone's scrutiny. To make matters worse, an unusual and unexpected problem had arisen. The daughter was approaching hysterics. It was worth it to go outside and see the child. She would change her route, but it was impossible to absolutely eliminate the possibility of meeting children. One day, Barbara and I were riding in the elevator, and a neighbor with a baby came in with us. Everything seemed fine, but I wasn't too happy. After the neighbor got off the elevator, I looked at my daughter and saw that her chin was bleeding. So hard she bit her lip trying to hold back a tantrum. After this incident, my daughter stayed at home all day and night for almost a month. Even a special doctor, the best of the best, I called home. There were changes, but not quick and not at all positive. After a period of apathy, my daughter became aggressive. It was as if she had developed an obsession, and the medications prescribed by the doctor couldn't handle it for long. Barbara would take the pills for a few hours, become apathetic. Then she'd start thinking about something, pacing the room from side to side. Once I saw that she was looking for poison options on the net, and I was seriously frightened. I realized that my daughter had decided to deal with the unwitting perpetrator of her children's deaths. I tried to be there all the time, to keep an eye on my daughter, so she wouldn't do anything irreparable. One morning, Barbara managed to leave the house while I was asleep. People told me later that she caught up with Frank after his work and attacked him with her fists. She was yelling you, "Why are you living here? Why don't our sons?" I don't know, maybe my acquaintances exaggerated. But supposedly 4 strong men could barely pull her away from a distraught Frank. He didn't even fight back. When I came to pick her up, my daughter was sitting in the back room, where the aroma of the hated Corvalol and some other drugs was wafting. She was almost unresponsive to anything. I was told that an ambulance had come and sedated Barbara. Among acquaintances and neighbors, of course, there was only talk about the accident with my grandchildren, and that Barbara was going crazy with grief. One day, Frank's father called me and urged me to leave town with his daughter. You don't say no to people like him. Besides, I was thinking of ways to hide my daughter from memories, sympathetic and prying eyes. I quit my job, sold my apartment, again thanks to my son-in-law's parents. I managed to do it quickly, and at a price that was quite adequate, given the urgency. Barbara and Frank were divorced in absentia, again thanks to his relatives. My daughter didn't even have to go anywhere. We ended up moving to this town, away from everything. And then you know the rest, Matthew. You met her and my daughter started to come back to life. Don't think Barbara still hates it. She's just still in pain. She even refuses the opportunity to be a mom again for fear of repeating the nightmare she went through. Audrey was silent. Telling her daughter's terrible story, the woman was mentally exhausted. Matthew noticed how pale her face had become and hurried to the kitchen to fetch her some water. Roger was playing on his phone, and the man stroked his head, refilled his glass, and returned to Audrey in the hall. "Sorry, what made you remember everything?" he asked. The woman drank the water carefully and spoke bitterly. "Ah, Matthew, if only it could be forgotten. I probably should have told you about Barbara's past sooner. I've been hesitant to tell you. My daughter still can't talk about it either, I understand." The man looked at the woman puzzled and confessed. "To be honest, I had no idea that Barbara's reluctance to become a mom could hide such a tragedy. I thought she probably didn't want to ruin her figure. I can't even imagine how she felt when she saw Roger in our kitchen. What a surprise to surprise her on our anniversary. How am I supposed to apologize to Barbara and make her understand?" I really didn't have anywhere to bring Roger, the man continued. And the boy, for a number of reasons. I had to be sheltered for a week or two in a comfortable and safe place where his parents' enemies would have no reason to look. It all came about almost by accident. I arrived at the branch and ran into an old friend on the street whom I hadn't seen since my discharge. Hugh is more than a friend. He's the only reason I survived the army. But it's a long story. In the civilian life, we were separated by our hometowns, and as it happens, our contacts were lost. I tried to find him on social networks, but no luck. I guess I should have been more persistent. Then I would have found him, and then I got busy building my career. Anyway, I hadn't seen him in 15 years, and now I meet Hugh in a city that's foreign to both of us. I know he's changed over the years, but I recognized him immediately. He almost walked past me without noticing, but I stopped him. It turned out Hugh had come to solve his sister's and her husband's problems. They were embroiled in a lawsuit with some inadequate people who were used to dealing with things in a criminal way. Roger, of course, is just a perfect boy. He got to know his way around in a strange place. He even went to bed by himself, having brushed his teeth beforehand. Hugh was most worried about Roger, his nephew. He explained to his sister that the child should be hidden just in case, because through him the bandits could easily influence the decision of the issue in their favor. But they couldn't think of any safe place. And that's where I came in. To Hugh, the idea of taking Roger out of town seemed the ideal. Indeed, there were practically no clues that could put the bandits on the child's trail. It was a good thing that the boy had a strong character, a real man growing up. His parents and Hugh told him he had to stay with me for a while, and he took the news calmly. I picked him up like a detective, so as not to get caught on the city's CCTV cameras. We agreed to contact Hugh in a week, and he's supposed to call me when it's resolved. Roger and I are very easy to talk to, but I have to work on Monday, and I can hardly take him with me. I don't know what to do now, the man said. Matthew was silent. Suddenly, he and Audrey heard Barbara's voice. "It's no big deal. You go to work as usual. I'll stay with Roger, only on the condition that the boy didn't have to take public transportation himself." It turned out that, contrary to Audrey's calculations, her daughter had already returned from the theater and seemed to have heard part of her husband's story. Preempting her mother's question, Barbara explained, "I couldn't watch the play in the theater. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and realized that I couldn't go back and stare at the stage without even trying to understand the story. I texted Gabriella to apologize and came here. Turns out I got back just in time. I guess I should have heard Roger's story from the outside because, Matthew, I'm sorry I suspected you of cheating. And I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me all that yesterday. Today I can look at the situation more rationally. Mom, you don't mind if I visit with Roger, do you?" Barbara asked. Audrey, trying not to frighten away the change in her daughter's attitude toward her children, spoke very carefully. "Of course, come." Audrey wanted to say something else, but tears came to her eyes and she decided to change the subject. "Barbara. Matthew, aren't you hungry? I could eat something right now. Let's go into the kitchen. All the more reason to see if Roger's having a good time. I've forgotten all about the rules of hospitality." When the boy saw Barbara, he remembered to say hello. The woman's voice trembled slightly as she responded to his greeting. Matthew, who had understood the reason for his wife's strange behavior, was now amazed at her resilience. She had been through such an ordeal and had never tried to appeal to his pity or to elicit sympathy by telling him what she had faced. Barbara gently but insistently dismissed Audrey's attempts to feed everyone gathered in her kitchen that evening. "Thank you, Mom, for everything, but we should probably go home. I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon," she said. Matthew, realizing that he had received his wife's forgiveness, was very happy and bid Audrey a heartfelt farewell, promising, "We'll visit you all tomorrow. If you are feeling well and the weather is warm, we can go to the countryside. How would you like that, Audrey?" "That's a wonderful idea, Matthew. Let's not get ahead of ourselves," the woman said. After saying goodbye to the hostess, Barbara, Matthew, and Roger drove to the other side of town. The man sat behind the wheel, and in the mirror he could see his wife carefully fastening the boy's seatbelt. It was obvious that for Barbara it was a completely natural gesture, brought once to automaticity. She was obviously a reverent, caring mother. She loved her children very much, and after the tragedy that had befallen her, she was suffering in a way that her worst enemy could not wish. Matthew carefully parked the car in the driveway. The man carried Roger, who had drowned, to the apartment. Barbara laid him on the couch, spreading the crumpled sheet, carefully removed the boy's shoes and covered him with a blanket. Watching his wife, Matthew felt incredible tenderness for her. Suddenly, the woman he loved opened up to him from an unfamiliar side of her personality, and he realized that he had made the absolutely right choice. Later, with the door to the kitchen closed, they drank tea with the remaining cake, and as if there had been no wall of misunderstanding between them yesterday. With jokes and kisses, they planned the schedule for Sunday afternoon. The man dared to bring up the unpleasant subject and confessed. "Barbara, I'm a real idiot. I almost ruined everything by my actions, and I want to say thank you very much for understanding." His wife smiled. "Well, to be honest, I overreacted too, so I suggest we forget it. Forget it." The weekend passed cheerfully, and even better than the spouses expected. They managed to get Audrey out for a walk, who was much less happy about the sunny May day than she was about her daughter's happy eyes. Barbara was happy to answer Roger's questions and to keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't in danger. Neither her mother nor her husband dared to reproach her for her hyper-opaque behavior. Roger did not seem to mind at all that he was surrounded by the utmost care. By agreement with Barbara, he called her by her first name without using the word aunt, and he seemed quite pleased with his unexpected journey. When they had brought Audrey home after the entertainment, the trio had to wait, for there was no chance of leaving the woman without being fed. No one minded, however. Late in the afternoon, as Barbara was putting Roger to bed, the boy asked her quietly, "Do you think my parents are doing well? Will I be able to see them soon?" Trying to keep her voice firm and convincing, Barbara replied, "Of course they are doing well. Very soon they will do all their business, and you will meet them." The reassured boy fell asleep. Barbara, fearful of waking the child, called her husband into the kitchen and began to question him about the story Roger's parents were involved in. "Barbara, I honestly don't even know all the details of that evening. My husband told me everything very briefly. But I realized that his sister and her husband were really attacked by some scumbags. The woman began to ask questions that surprised her husband. These bandits are from the town you went to, or are they newcomers? Did they call each other anything? Did they have nicknames? Matthew told everything he knew. But it was not enough for Barbara, and she suddenly asked, "Can't you get in touch with Hugh urgently? I need to get some clarifications from him to try to help Roger's parents. Of course, he's not bad and quite comfortable with us, I hope, but it shouldn't be that mother and son are separated for long." It was impossible to guess from Barbara's voice how closely she took Roger and his parents' situation to heart. But now, knowing about his wife's past, Matthew realized how difficult it was for her. In fact, Hugh gave me a password to a chat room that automatically deletes all messages. I think we can try to contact him. The man opened the necessary site, entered the data that he had learned by heart at the request of his army friend, and after a few minutes he exclaimed with joy, "It worked. See, he welcomed me." Barbara thoughtfully advised, "Matthew, ask him a question that you can tell if he's talking to you. And if there's even the slightest doubt, close the site immediately and pull the SIM card out of the phone." Alarmed by his wife's suspicions, Matthew quickly typed a few phrases and waited impatiently for a reply. After reading the message he received, the man exhaled a sigh of relief. "It's okay. It's definitely Hugh," he answered with our code phrase. Barbara nodded and asked, "Okay, text Hugh that your wife will be texting him now. And give me the phone number. I'll find out everything I need to know from your friend." No longer surprised by anything, Matthew handed the smartphone to his wife. She texted with someone she didn't know for quite a while. Then she grabbed a pen, quickly wrote down a number on a bread wrapper, tore off a piece of paper with numbers on it, clutched it in her hand, and handed the phone to her husband. Barbara left the kitchen and headed for the bathroom, which had the best noise insulation in the apartment. After taking a few deep breaths, the woman dialed her former father-in-law's memorized number. But the phone was unavailable. Barbara gathered all her will and dialed her ex-husband's number. Soon his voice sounded in the receiver. "Hello. Don't be silent." "Frank, it's me, Barbara." Her voice trembled with excitement. "Barbara, it's good to hear from you." The man's demanding tone softened considerably. "My father is abroad, but if you tell me what the problem is, I'll do my best to help you. I am now working in the regional prosecutor's office, so all my connections are at your service." "Thank you," the woman replied and told me everything she had learned, dictating the number she had written down. "Okay, Barbara, I get it. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's manageable. I think in the end, for every scumbag, there's a more powerful force. I'll try to help and warn this acquaintance that I'll call him tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, depending on how things turn out. He'll be able to take the call from his cell phone." "Thank you, Frank." Without waiting for her ex-husband's retort, Barbara ended the conversation and washed her face with ice water, hoping that it would bring her at least a semblance of composure. During her conversation with Frank, she wanted to apologize to him, but she couldn't. The bitter resentment of his neglect, which had caused her to lose her children, still burned her heart. At the same time, Barbara was well aware that without the intervention of her ex-husband, who had extensive connections in the area, Roger's family was practically doomed. And she wanted to keep the boy safe and try to save his parents. For a while, Barbara sat in the bathroom, equalizing her breathing with exercises. Seeing that an hour had practically passed, she returned to Matthew in the kitchen and informed him of what Frank had said. The man texted his friend the information he had received from his wife and hugged Barbara tightly. He saw how exhausted the woman he loved had become in the last hour and didn't know how to help her. He wanted to protect her from all adversity. Instead, Barbara had to turn, as Matthew easily guessed, to the man who had nearly destroyed her destiny to the ground. The conversation stirred the woman. She released herself from Matthew's embrace and automatically began clearing the table, not paying attention to the fact that she was sending her husband's completely untouched food into the trash. Finally, the man intercepted her hand and suggested, "Drop the fuss. It's been a hard day and we need to rest." Even as she listened to the peaceful breathing of her sleeping husband, Barbara could not calm down. The images of her little ones came to her mind's eye. They smiled toothless smiles at her. Then they were going to kindergarten for the first time and turning to the window, waving their little hands at her. They give her Mother's Day cards. Here, obviously conspiring, instead of falling asleep, they clap loudly and unanimously when she starts to sing them a lullaby. How many pleasant moments there were, so carefully stored somewhere far away in the memory. And so rudely all had been crossed out by an accident. How many times she had warned her sons not to take risks. And they still wouldn't listen. But what was the use of being angry now? You can't get the water back. Their father is now the only hope that Roger will soon be able to hug his mother. At least let Frank be able to help this complete stranger to Barbara. Bab, 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 Roger mumbled, and Barbara slipped out from under her husband's arm and hurried to the boy. Carefully she adjusted the blanket, which he had almost thrown to the floor. Felt Roger's forehead, frightened that the child had spiked a fever, and breathing a sigh of relief, sensing that, from her experience, all was well. Roger opened his eyes and Barbara sat down on the edge of the couch and hummed softly a lullaby. The boy had long since fallen asleep, but the woman remained seated beside him. She wanted the child to return to his parents as soon as possible, and at the same time she realized that she would desperately miss spending time with him. As the sky, visible through the slit between the curtains, lightened, Barbara went quietly to the kitchen to make herself some coffee and work on her papers, because there was no point in going to bed. In these lucid hours, maybe somewhere far away, were already deciding issues directly related to the fate of Roger. But Barbara was powerless to influence anything. She had already done all that she could, overcoming her resentment. And now all that remained was to wait for the result. After carefully studying the papers, the woman made notes in the margins, wrote out her suggestions on a separate sheet of paper, and carefully tucking everything away in a zippered folder, began, trying not to make any noise, to prepare breakfast. She had already decided to ask Audrey's boss to excuse her, so as not to tire the boy out too much by moving around unfamiliar places. After waiting for the time to send messages, Barbara typed to Audrey that she would send the prepared documents through her husband. She began to think about what she could do to please the little guest, who of course was worried about being separated from his parents, although he was trying to be a good boy. When Matthew, who had showered but was still yawning, came into the kitchen, Barbara had almost everything ready. She invited her husband to the table and asked, "Matthew, stop by on your way to Jack's and give him the file for me. I've already warned him that I won't be able to stop by work for a few days. And if there's anything that needs to be reviewed, have him email it to me or have it forwarded through you. As a last resort, of course, I'll come over. But I don't want to stress Roger out. I was going to take him to Audrey's mom's and then go to the Children's Entertainment Center. Why does he have to play on the computer all the time? Let him have fun, let him have fun, let him have fun, let him have fun. Keep his mind off the sad stuff. He was having nightmares at night." Matthew agreed to his wife's plan, and after quickly swallowing his breakfast, he thanked her and began to get ready for work. Roger woke up much later, but Barbara didn't think to wake him up. She wanted the boy to feel no discomfort. The woman fed the child and then suggested, "Let's stop by my mom's for a while and then we'll go somewhere to rest." Barbara received a text message on her phone, and she smiled when she saw the notification that the money had been deposited. Matthew made sure his wife didn't have any financial problems. The woman smiled and asked the boy, "Would you like me and you to go to an amusement park? It's not far from the city, and there are many different options for a fun vacation, a laughing room, rope courses, and I think even a climbing wall. Do you like that kind of active entertainment? Or maybe you prefer a movie? That's no problem either. I haven't seen a movie on the big screen in a long time." Roger confessed embarrassedly, "I'd rather go to an amusement park, to be honest. So that's where we'll head." Audrey was delighted when her daughter came to see her with the boy. It meant that Barbara believed her husband and didn't go out of her way to demand that the child be placed somewhere because of her traumas and memories. She could see that Barbara seemed desperate even after her brief interaction with Roger and barely got them to leave as soon as possible. "Daughter, I feel just fine today. Go have fun. I'll call you if there's anything, of course. In fact, don't worry about it. Really, I have more energy today after yesterday's walk." Audrey turned to the boy and asked Roger, "I beg you, rest well for you and for me." The boy nodded gravely and promised. I'll have Barbara take pictures and send them to you. You have an advanced smartphone, don't you? The woman smiled and praised. Well done. That's a great idea. I'm sure I'll have fun with you. Barbara checked. Do you have a charged cell phone? Barbara reassured her mother, saying she could recharge her phone in the car at any time. Soon the guests left Audrey, and she, left alone, began to dream that her daughter would finally decide to be a mom again. It was obvious to the woman that Barbara could perfectly find a common language with children. She had suffered for so many years, purposely avoiding contact with them. Let everything turn out well for the injured girl, Audrey pleaded, hoping aloud that the plea would be heard somewhere upstairs. Barbara, driving with particular care, was taking Roger for fun and felt the weight of the responsibility she had voluntarily taken on. The boy had first of all asked to go on the rope course, and the woman had agreed. She wanted to grab the child in her arms and hold him in her arms. Barbara watched the boy and took photos from time to time, but she didn't dare to distract herself from sending especially expressive pictures to her mother. It seemed to the woman that if she took her eyes off the boy for even a few seconds, something bad would happen. The thought crossed her mind of the degree of desperation Roger's mom was in if she agreed to give her son to a near stranger. Such an act could only be dared because of the real threat to the child's life and health. So she, Barbara, had no right to let down a woman about whom she knew the bare minimum of information: name, surname, age, and the fact that the unfortunate woman, together with her husband, had gotten involved in a story from which she could not get out on her own. Barbara, however, was in an even more advantageous position. Erin, Roger's mother, knew even less about the people who had taken her son in. The fun-filled Monday had flashed by without a second thought. The boy, tired from his many outdoor activities, fell asleep after a hearty dinner and rested peacefully until morning without crying out or waking up. Matthew and Barbara chatted quietly in the kitchen. The woman spoke enthusiastically about how bravely Roger had conquered the rides and showed pictures. Tomorrow I want to take our guest to our museums after his visit to his mother, and then go to the movies. Or vice versa, whichever Roger wants. If you can join us, it'll be fun. He's so funny, and sometimes he has such deep thoughts. He told me today that adults try to look serious on purpose so that they'll be afraid and no one will bother them. Can you believe that? The man agreed that there was something reasonable in that conclusion. And I suggest, Barbara, let's go to bed like Roger. Because tomorrow I expect it's going to be just as busy. Neither Tuesday nor Wednesday brought word from Frank or the boy's relatives. Although the child attended all sorts of entertaining and educational establishments, his mood grew worse every day. He became more and more reflective and sad. Matthew and Barbara realized that the boy was missing his family more and more, but they could not influence the situation. Only on Thursday, when Barbara and Roger were visiting Audrey, the long-awaited call came. Frank informed his ex-wife that the main difficulties were over and warned. There are still a few things to be resolved, but that's minor. The main thing is that the boy is no longer in danger. His parents have already left in the direction of the city where you now live. I warned them to call you in advance, as they will arrive, and clarify the address. Anyway, I'll take this case to the final point, of course. Don't worry. Barbara thanked her ex-husband profusely. Thank you, Frank, and forgive me for everything. The man's voice was ringing as he replied to the woman he had hurt so much. Barbara, you don't know how glad I am to hear from you, even if it's for such an occasion. I wish you happiness, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to contact me. I'll always be glad to help you. Barbara said goodbye to her ex-husband. Audrey, hearing her daughter's conversation, couldn't believe her own ears. It seems that her Barbara quite adequately just communicated with a man whom she had once loved and then hated. Mom, we have to leave. Roger's parents are already on the road, and I still need to give him a bath. The child realized that he would soon see his mom and dad and started jumping around the room, shouting yay. Barbara barely managed to keep him quiet. Audrey, happy that the situation had been resolved safely, gave the boy a souvenir of her photograph and a collection of stamps, which he liked so much. Here you go, Roger. You'll look at the album and remember. I won't forget me, Grandma Audrey, even without stamps, the child promised. Seizing the moment, Barbara called her husband to tell him the good news, but it turned out he already knew. Barbara, Hugh told me that your help has solved everything. I'm taking a cab home now to get ready for the party. Barbara was a little sad to part with the boy who had awakened in her memories of the most joyous days with her sons, and she invited him to visit the toy store on the way. You know, I'd really like to get you something too. Choose whatever you want. The boy did not resist, but apparently embarrassed, did not walk for a long time between the racks with toys on display. And very soon he took from the shelf not the most expensive robot. On the way to the checkout, Barbara put in the basket an airplane, which Roger had once told her admiringly, and some more board games. Oh, so many things, marveled the child. What a celebration today. Yes, Roger, it's a very big party today, Barbara agreed. By the time the doorbell rang, the boy was already cleanly ransomed and the cutlery was flaunting on the table. Erin, barely over the threshold, rushed to her son, hugging him and showering him with kisses. The boy's father handed Barbara flowers, and Hugh gave Matthew a firm, manly hug. After Roger, assuming the role of an adult, introduced the parents to the owners of the apartment, everyone sat down to eat. Erin volunteered to help Barbara and confessed, "If it weren't for your kindness, I don't know how we would have gotten through this. I don't know how to express my gratitude. My husband and I have raised money to offset the cost of Roger and your inconvenience." Barbara turned pale and replied, "Erin, put that envelope away at once. Don't insult me with this act. You have a boy who will be going to school soon, so spend this money on him. If it's not too much trouble, send me and my husband a picture of him once in a while. That would be the best thanks." Outraged, Erin burst into tears and hugged Barbara. When Roger, disturbed by his mother and Barbara's long absence from the table, looked into the kitchen, he saw the women roaring, unable to hold back their tears, and began to ask in a mature manner, "What happened? Did you get bumped, cut, burned?" Barbara and Erin wiped away their tears synchronously. "It's okay, sweetie, and everything is just fine," the mom reassured her son. Putting her arms around the boy, she picked him up, lifted him up, and surrounded him. Barbara watched the happy people and did not feel envy, but wished that this family had all the turmoil in the past. After the guests had departed, Barbara trustingly snuggled up to her husband and confided to him, "You know, I think I'm ready for motherhood. Roger proved to me that children are the greatest happiness." The man did not change his wife's mind. Soon Barbara pleased him and Audrey with the news of her pregnancy. Exactly on time and without any complications, the woman gave birth to a daughter. The girl was named Sharon in honor of Matthew's army friend, and as a symbol of victory over the terrible memories of the past.